Hey guys, imagine standing in a candlelit alehouse, smoke curling above rough-hewn beams, while a hooded minstrel whispers rumors of herbs that can make you glimpse heaven or tumble straight into a ditch. Strange brews, screaming roots, flying ointments. Tonight we're prying open the dusty apothecary of the Middle Ages to see exactly how our ancestors got gloriously, terrifyingly high. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. Picture a gray dawn in a walled town that smells of damp wool and yesterday's onions. Somewhere between the fishmonger's stall and the church bells, a barefoot herbalist called Old Lisbeth sets up shop. Her apron pockets bulge with dried leaves, twisted pods, and a tiny carved figurine that looks suspiciously like a man mid-shriek. Patrons shuffle forward, clutching aches, sorrows, and a secret hope that Lisbeth's pouches offer more than splints and poultices. She winks, mutters a prayer, and weighs out a modest pinch of henbane, just enough to silence the tooth that's been throbbing like a sinner's conscience. But when the sun dips and ale flows, that same henbane will drift from medicine to mischief, and the night will warp like a funhouse mirror no medieval carpenter ever built. You see, medieval Europe never kept its pharmacopoeia in neat moral columns labeled good and evil. Everything lived on a sliding scale of remedy to revelation to outright ruin, with dosage as the fickle gatekeeper. The village priest might bless a tincture in the morning, then condemn the very same concoction at vespers if the dosage, or the dream it sparked, tipped too far into the uncanny. It was a world where your pharmacist, your therapist, and your spiritual medium could all be the same mud-splattered stranger at market, and nobody bothered with the child safety cap. Take the poppy. Long before Victorian laudanum bottles rattled in bedside drawers, medieval surgeons already understood the crimson flower's hush, the pain magic. During trepanning, yes, drilling a hole in your skull without modern anesthetic, a cloth soaked in poppy wine might be pressed beneath the patient's nose. One deep inhale and the skull split felt less like a hand-carved nightmare, and more like drifting through blurred cathedral arches bathed in stained glass light. Apothecaries called it a sleeping sponge, a dainty name for something strong enough to let a barber surgeon rummage inside your thoughts, literally. But poppy dreams were polite compared to henbane's carnival. Henbane, that scruffy cousin of tobacco with leaves that reek of dead mice, grew in dung heaps in graveyards. Nature's cheeky hint that messing with it might blur the border between worlds. In tiny nips it soothed coughs. In heartier handfuls it sparked hallucinations where tavern benches melted, faces elongated, and the local miller's donkey debated theology in flawless Latin. Rural courts kept records of perplexed reeves trying to find peasants for disruptive lunar barking after henbane-laced beer made them howl at imaginary moons. Of course, the church blamed the devil, the peasants blamed bad grain, and the henbane plants just kept swaying in the breeze, waiting for the next curious soul. Meanwhile, Mandrake commanded a marketing strategy any TikTok herbalist would envy. Shaped like a human in miniature, 2 stumpy legs, gnarly torso, twin nubs that pass for arms, the root came wrapped in lethal folklore. Tug it up wrong, folks insisted, and its ear-splitting scream would shatter your eardrums, shrivel your heart, maybe unbuckle your soul for good measure. The workaround? Tie the root to a hungry dog, coax Fido to bolt, and cover your ears. If the dog keeled over, well, you mourned Sparky and collected your treasure. A root rumored to heal barrenness, summon prophetic dreams, or knock a man unconscious long enough for field surgery. Black-hooded scholars at Salerno's medical school even documented recipes. Mandrake simmered in wine until the vapor itself could lull patients into a stupor deeper than any sermon ever managed. Yet the medieval menu of mindbenders wasn't limited to plants you could pluck. Consider ergot, the purple fungus hitchhiking on rye stalks. In warm, damp summers, it replaced golden grains with soot-dark spikes packed with alkaloids. Bread baked from infected rye was a gamble. Some loaves only tingled tongues, others triggered convulsions, gangrene, and a dancing mania that sent whole villages spinning through fields until exhaustion or death tapped them out. Chroniclers called it St. Anthony's fire, because victims begged the saints' monks for relief while their limbs burned with phantom heat. Still, a cunning midwife might shave off just enough ergot dust to quicken a stalled labor, trusting her instinct to toe the line between birth cry and funeral dirge. If you were higher up the food chain, say a silk-clad countess with a taste for danger, you might dabble in belladonna. Drops distilled from its glossy berries dilated the pupils until eyes gleamed like polished jet. Beauty? Absolutely. Also blurred vision, wild heartbeat, and dreams where angels wore dentists' masks. Physicians prescribed it to calm female hysteria, a blanket term covering everything from cramps to the scandalous desire to read books. Courts buzzed with rumors of ladies who, after a belladonna draft, swore they conversed with saints, only to realize later they'd been chatting to the fireplace poker for 4 hours. But who could blame them? In a world where a woman's curiosity often earned her side-eye, a sanctioned trance offered escape, agency, even fleeting power. Power, in fact, is the tinder that lit many medieval trips. Monks in remote abbeys cultivated secret gardens of visionary herbs, believing intense visions could shortcut months of dry theological study. One Cistercian chronicle tells of Brother Theobald who, after nibbling a courage radish, reported soaring above the cloister, spotting a sin-black stain on the abbot's soul, and landing upside down in the herb patch. Was it scandal or salvation? Depends which scribe you consult, but the abbot quietly uprooted every last radish the next day. Witches, meanwhile, wore the stigma of flight, sometimes literally. The infamous flying ointment appears in court records like a medieval urban legend. Ingredients lists fluctuate: henbane, belladonna, mandrake, aconite, baby fat if you believe the nastiest pamphlets. But the method stays lurid: smear on pulse points or more intimate membranes. Utter incantations and feel your body lighten like parchment in a chimney draft. Modern historians suspect the sensation of flight was a full-body hallucination combined with the vestibular confusion of semi-paralysis. Imagine lying plastered on a barn floor while your inner ear insists you're swooping over moonlit forests. Sounds thrilling until your neighbors find you at dawn covered in chicken feathers and existential doubt. Yet not all medieval highs swirled in secrecy or sin. Public festivals turned intoxication into communal theater. Think of the Feast of Fools, where lower clergy donned masks, crowned a mock bishop, and guzzled spiced wine laced with who knows what, until solemn chants morphed into bawdy ballads. For one riotous night, hierarchies flipped, inhibitions dissolved, and even the sternest canon lawyers danced barefoot on frozen cobbles. Was it purely spiritual release? Officially, yes. Unofficially, those casks brewed potent courage, blurring the memory of tomorrow's inevitable penance. Of course, every high has a hangover, and medieval folks were champions at regret. Herbal manuals devote pages to sobering drafts: sour apple vinegar, powdered pearls, even ground hooves boiled in honey. Physicians believed imbalance of humors: too much black bile, not enough phlegm, caused the post-party darkness. Some remedies read like punishment: gargle rancid sheep fat, vomit, then pray harder. Yet diaries hint that what truly cured the shakes was storytelling, gathering by hearthlight to swap cautionary tales of trips gone sideways. Like the Bristol mason who drank dodgy datura wine and insisted the town well was a portal to Avalon, or the nun who inhaled burning juniper, foresaw Christ's return on a war goat, and had to copy psalms for months as atonement. Fear plus laughter forged memories sticky enough to linger, steering the next would-be psychonaut to double-check a dosage, or at least double-knot the mandrake rope. Still, curiosity outpaced caution. Pilgrims trudging to Santiago traded satchels of frankincense for resinous chunks of hashish shipped via Moorish Spain. Traders along the Silk Road whispered of betel nut, opium, fermented mare's milk. Temptations that made European hedge witch murals look tame. Each exotic sample arrived without a manual, leaving trial, error, and the occasional funeral to scribble the footnotes. Merchants grew rich, clergy grew anxious, and somewhere a teenage squire borrowed coin to sample a Saracen sugar that turned him into the life of the armory for precisely 11 minutes before he face-planted into a barrel of nails. None of this, mind you, unfolded against a silent backdrop. Imagine the soundscape: blacksmith hammers clanging like offbeat metronomes, geese honking at unmanned gates, distant wolf howls mixing with lute tunes drifting from taverns. These noises framed every medieval trip, sculpting hallucinations with their echoing layers. A simple church bell might morph into an angelic choir or a demon's gong, depending on whether henbane or holy wafer slid down your throat first. The line between sacred and psychedelic blurred, overlapped, sometimes fused so completely that a vision during Mass could pass as miracle or heresy with equal ease. One wrong sigh, one ill-timed stumble, and a worshipper might earn a slot in the Inquisitor's ledger marked suspicious ecstasies. Yet for many, the promise of revelation outweighed the peril. Imagine a serf whose horizon ends at the landlord's hedge, who'll likely live and die within the same plowed furlongs. A handful of psilocybin mushrooms sprouting after autumn rain could hand that serf a technicolor vista of swirling saints, speaking animals, and the fleeting illusion that the feudal chain has snapped. For a night, plowshares glow like comet trails, debts dissolve in laughter, and the sky writes messages in molten gold. Come dawn, the hedge is still there, but so is the memory, a private spark of more tucked behind weather-cracked eyes. We modern folk chase highs in sleek capsules and neon bars, but medieval thrill-seekers walk their crooked alleys with pockets full of roots and prayers, trusting rumor, ritual, and gut instinct. They learned, sometimes fatally, that nature is both physician and prankster, and their legacies, those scribbled herbals, those court testimonies, those folk songs about dancing cows, remind us that the desire to tilt reality, to peek behind the curtain, didn't arrive with lab-grown tabs or vape pens. It's older than castles, older than cathedrals, etched into human hunger for wonder as deeply as any stained glass saint. So as the candle gutters low and the fan hum merges with imaginary crickets in your headphones, tuck this first chapter under your pillow. Somewhere in the musty halls of history, a peasant, a monk, and a countess all raise different cups, seeking the same flicker of otherworldly light. Tomorrow we'll pry deeper, into recipes that curled toes, into church edicts that failed spectacularly, and into the whispered confession of a royal physician whose patient woke up married to a tree. But for now, let the shadows settle, breathe slow, and remember, the Middle Ages were never just mud and misery. They were laced with sparks that set even the darkest nights aflame. Let's pick up the thread, still woven with herb smoke and candle wax, and follow it a little deeper into the winding halls of medieval intoxication. Last night, we saw how peasants, monks, and nobles all flirted with altered states using whatever grew, festered, or fermented near their feet. Tonight, we slip into the hush of monastery libraries, slip past the stern glance of bishops, and crack open the murky world of forbidden knowledge. Because getting high in medieval times wasn't just about wild plants, it was about who got to explore and who got punished for it. The first thing to understand is this: knowledge was power. And in the Middle Ages, power belonged to people who could read Latin, own land, and afford to make their bad trips sound like religious epiphanies. If a nobleman saw angels during a mushroom-induced fever, it was often chalked up to divine insight. If a peasant woman saw the same thing, she was at risk of being labeled a witch, or at best, quietly ignored. Medical texts written by educated men, often monks or university-trained physicians, describe dream herbs and sleep potions with almost clinical detachment. The Trotula, a famous 12th century gynecological manual attributed to a woman physician of Salerno, though likely compiled by men, includes recipes for inducing labor or calming hysteria using opiates, cannabis, and other sedatives. These weren't party favors. They were considered serious tools for managing the mysteries of the body. But even in those texts, there's a quiet reverence for the blurry edge between the physical and the spiritual, the known and the mysterious. For instance, the writings of Hildegard of Bingen, a German abbess, mystic, composer, and all-around spiritual powerhouse of the 12th century, are riddled with visions. Some scholars believe her trances may have been brought on by migraines, or perhaps mild ergot poisoning. But the way she describes them, the colors, the swirling lights, the sense of being flooded with divine presence, reads like a psychedelic journal. She claimed her visions came from God, and because she was cloistered, obedient, and respected, no one dared accuse her of witchcraft. But take those same descriptions, put them in the mouth of a shepherd's daughter, and the local bailiff might have come knocking. Then there's the Book of Secrets of Albertus Magnus, a text that dances a very fine line between medicine, magic, and madness. Attributed to a 13th century Dominican friar, it reads like a medieval mashup of herbal guide, potion manual, and occult playbook. It describes how to make sleeping potions, love philters, and even shape-shifting ointments. One recipe calls for a mix of belladonna and opium dissolved in vinegar and wine, something that would knock you sideways whether you wanted it to or not. But here's the twist. If a friar had that recipe, it was studied. If a midwife had it, it was suspicious. If a widow living alone had it, it was damning. You see, context was everything. A noble could fund an alchemist to experiment with psychoactive plants in the name of science or philosophy. A traveling healer using the same ingredients could be burned for witchcraft. The line between scholar and sorcerer was as thin as a veil of incense, and just as easily blown aside by politics, fear, or rumor. Now, let's detour to the markets. Picture a late autumn morning. Mist hangs in the air, pigs squeal in their pens, and every wooden stall is draped in garlands of dried herbs. But not all herbs are meant for seasoning soup. In one corner, a weathered trader lays out strange roots and seeds, some shaped like claws, others shimmering with oil. He doesn't shout his wares. His customers come quietly, slipping coins into his palm and walking away with wrapped bundles they don't open until nightfall. Many of these traders moved along the fringes of society. Some were Romani, others former soldiers or Moorish exiles, all bringing with them knowledge passed orally, unwritten, unregulated, and deeply distrusted. They knew how to brew cannabis tea with wine and honey. They ground nutmeg, then considered a luxury import, into calming powders. They traded in dreams, but their prices weren't always in coin. Sometimes they asked for a secret, a lock of hair, a favor owed on a stormy night. Cannabis, by the way, had a long-standing presence in Europe. Hemp was cultivated widely for rope, cloth, and oil, but the flowers? Those had another purpose. In some regions, the flowering tops were dried and smoked or steeped into teas, often mixed with other herbs like thyme or mugwort. It was used to ease childbirth, soothe pain, and, when combined with music and storytelling, open the mind to other voices. It was rarely condemned outright, but it was always whispered about. The church knew of it, tolerated it when used for illness, and eyed it suspiciously when it became recreational. And speaking of the church, let's talk exorcisms. Yes, exorcisms. Because not all altered states were welcomed with open arms. When a person, especially a woman or a poor laborer, claimed visions, spoke in tongues, or experienced mad dancing, the church often responded not with herbs, but with holy water and stern chants. Many of the possessed likely suffered from epilepsy, mental illness, or had simply ingested something questionable. But in an age without neurology, the line between demonic possession and accidental trip was often misread. Some priests believed that Satan used herbs to twist the mind. Others feared that spirits could slip into the soul through open consciousness. That fear gave rise to spiritual paranoia, a world where even drinking a bitter cup of valerian tea could raise eyebrows if you smiled too dreamily afterward. And yet, even church authorities weren't immune to curiosity. Tucked into monastery chronicles are odd moments, brothers who inhaled smoke from burning resins during long fasts and claimed to see heavenly choirs, priors who warned against temptation but quietly authorized the growing of sleep-inducing plants in garden corners. The difference between sacred and sinful was often how well you could frame your experience in scripture afterward. Now, let's travel to the bathhouse. In many medieval towns, bathhouses weren't just for scrubbing grime. They were social centers, gossip hubs, and occasionally dens of indulgence. In certain bathhouses, attendants offered clients small doses of mood-altering herbs mixed into steam or wine. A little mugwort said to enhance dreams. A bit of datura, just a pinch, to ease aches and lull the mind. After all, many bathhouses operated after sundown, under flickering oil lamps and within thick stone walls that kept secrets better than any servant ever could. But things could turn strange. There are a few surviving accounts, half folklore, half witness statement, of bathhouse visitors stripping off their tunics, stepping into the steam, sipping a herbal concoction, and emerging convinced they were someone else entirely. A fishmonger who insisted he was the Duke of Aquitaine. a blacksmith who tried to bribe the attendant for a potion that makes you invisible to debt collectors. Whether these stories are true, exaggerated, or metaphorical doesn't matter. What matters is that they were told, retold, and believed, because they revealed a truth medieval people knew instinctively. The mind is a fragile, flickering thing, and certain leaves and roots had the power to shift its flame. Then there were the alchemists, those hunched figures surrounded by beakers, flames, and crumbling scrolls. While most were seeking gold or immortality, some dabbled in subtler transformations. Alchemy wasn't just about transmuting metal. It was also about purifying the spirit, burning away illusions, and reaching higher planes of thought. In that sense, certain alchemists became proto-psychonauts, medieval scientists using herbs and minerals to open consciousness. One 14th century manuscript, scribbled in Latin with footnotes in Old French, includes a section on the emerald vapors, believed to induce divine insight. The recipe? Pine resin, crushed camphor, fermented honey, and a handful of dried poppy petals, heated until the fumes filled the room. Practitioners would sit for hours inhaling the smoke, eyes closed, waiting for symbols or visions to manifest. It was dangerous, intoxicating, and deeply mystical, and very few outside the educated elite ever had access to it. But not every altered state needed herbs or smoke. In the depths of winter, during long fasts or pilgrimage, people often reported visions brought on by exhaustion, hunger, or cold. These were technically natural highs, states induced not by substance but by deprivation. A peasant who walked barefoot across a frozen plain to reach a holy shrine might arrive delirious, starving, and absolutely convinced they had spoken with the Virgin Mary. The Church, in these cases, was more likely to believe, because these visions had been earned through suffering, not taken like a shortcut. And so, medieval people lived in a world of possibilities, where an herb could be your healer or your doom, where the same root used in a monastery garden could get a hedge witch hanged, and where the boundary between medicine, magic, and mysticism was almost non-existent. In tomorrow's chapter, we'll dig into the darker corners, into confessions taken under torture, into the role of state and crown in controlling substances, and into one particularly unlucky bishop who accidentally dosed the entire cathedral choir with a clarity elixir that had some unexpected results. Tonight, the fog thickens. You've walked through medieval herb gardens and stood beside steaming bathhouse pools, but now we take a quieter, colder turn, down into the darker chambers of power, fear, and punishment, because while the act of getting high in the Middle Ages could be playful, spiritual, or simply medicinal, it could also be criminal. And as the centuries turned and paranoia deepened, the authorities, the church, the crown, and the local magistrates began to ask harder questions about what people were putting into their bodies and what it meant for their souls. Let's begin with a confession. The year is 1322. A scribe in southern France sits by candlelight in a damp cell, copying the testimony of a woman called Isabeau. She's been accused of sorcery, her crime vague but deeply feared. She gave her neighbor a drink that made him see lights where there were none and laugh when no one spoke. The village priest believes it was demonic trickery. Isabeau says it was just a sleep tea, made with wine, poppy petals, and a pinch of crushed seeds passed to her from her grandmother. But here's the problem. Those seeds came from a plant called henbane, and by the early 14th century, henbane was on the church's mental blacklist. A known hallucinogen, it was used across Europe in sleep potions, vision ointments, and as a crude painkiller. But it also made people twitch, babble, and sometimes faint into trance-like states that looked an awful lot like demonic possession. So was Isabeau a healer, a witch, or just a woman who knew a little too much about the plants growing near her doorstep? She was tortured, of course, gently at first, just questions and cold nights, then more directly. She confessed to flying, to whispering with spirits, to stirring dreams into mugs of cider. Whether those dreams came from herbs, or the wild desperation of a woman on the rack, we'll never know. This was a turning point in medieval Europe, when centuries of folklore and plant lore began colliding violently with institutions of control. Earlier, as we saw, many psychoactive herbs were tolerated or even revered when used by the right hands, monks, physicians, scholars. But now, as centralized power grew and fear of heresy spread like wildfire, the very same knowledge became suspicious. Consider the witch's flying ointment. a recipe whispered across regions, rumored to let women fly at night, often to secret gatherings. Historians now believe these flights were drug-induced hallucinations, not broomstick rides. The ointment often included a mixture of fats, usually animal lard or goose grease, infused with belladonna, henbane, mandrake, and sometimes opium. Rubbed on the skin or applied to sensitive areas, it bypassed digestion and entered the bloodstream quickly. The effects? Vivid visions, a sense of floating, detachment from the body, time dilation. In modern terms, a full-blown dissociative and hallucinogenic trip. To medieval inquisitors, this was Satan's fingerprint, but to the women who used it, often midwives, herbalists, or just curious villagers, it may have felt like an escape, a journey, a dream where, for a few precious hours, they weren't bound by land, law, or expectation. In one preserved Inquisition document from 1489, a woman in the Low Countries describes how she rode upon the air to the mountaintop, where she drank green wine and danced with shadows. The inquisitors pressed her for names of demons, but her testimony, when read with modern eyes, sounds far more like the experience of someone deep in a psychotropic state than a recruit in a satanic cult. Of course, you weren't safe just because you were a man. Let's talk about a strange event recorded in 1357 in northern Italy. A bishop, known for his eccentric sermons and love of strange relics, decided to host a celebratory mass after acquiring what he believed was a scrap of linen from St. Peter's burial shroud. To mark the occasion, his cooks prepared a special wine infused with herbs, meant to bring clarity and spiritual openness. The blend included wormwood, lavender, and crushed poppy husks. Unfortunately, someone mismeasured. Halfway through the service, the cathedral choir began giggling, then shouting, then weeping openly. One monk claimed the statue of St. Michael winked at him. A deacon dropped his candle and began dancing in circles, insisting he could hear trumpets from heaven. The bishop himself collapsed during the homily and awoke speaking in what was either corrupted Latin or utter gibberish. The entire episode was hushed up. The cook disappeared. The wine barrels were destroyed, but the record survives in the margins of a cleric's diary with a note. This is why laymen must not meddle with the sacraments of vision. What happened that day was likely a case of accidental mass intoxication, something that occurred more than once in medieval history. Sometimes it came from ergot-contaminated rye bread. Eat enough of it, and symptoms include convulsions, hallucinations, burning sensations, and visions of angels or demons. Entire villages were affected during bad harvests. There are reports from France, Germany, and England of dancing plagues, where peasants would move uncontrollably for hours, sometimes days. One famous case occurred in Strasbourg in 1518, where dozens of people danced in the streets, unable to stop. Some collapsed, a few died. Historians still debate whether it was mass psychosis, hunger, spiritual ecstasy, or ergot poisoning, but the connection to altered mental states is impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, the elites were refining their highs. While peasants danced in dirt roads, noble courts experimented with more acceptable substances, often imported from the East. Exotic resins, spiced wines, perfumed smokes. In some German courts, it was fashionable to blend myrrh and frankincense into tobacco-like powders and gently inhale the fumes through hollow reeds. These were considered civilized relaxants, even though some mixtures included trace amounts of poppy or nightshade. In Moorish Spain, where Muslim, Christian, and Jewish cultures interwove in complex patterns, psychoactive exploration was even more sophisticated. Andalusian physicians documented the effects of hashish, saffron, and henbane in medical detail. In the courts of Cordoba and Granada, it wasn't unusual for poets and musicians to sip hashish-infused sherbets during moonlit garden performances. The language of those poems, lush, surreal, dreamlike, often reads like someone writing from the edge of a deeply pleasant haze. But such luxury was rare. Most people sought simpler paths. Fasting, for example, remained a deeply respected and widely practiced method of inducing altered states. Saints, mystics, and pilgrims often described visions brought on after days without food or sleep. These highs were considered holy, not because of what caused them, but because they aligned with religious suffering. In fact, one 15th century account describes a monk who refused all food except herbs steeped in water. After 18 days, he began seeing wheels of fire and hearing a woman's voice reciting scripture. Rather than question the nature of his visions, the abbot promoted him. But that was always the double standard. If your visions fit the expected script, angels, saints, divine music, you were revered. If they didn't, or worse, if they came after drinking something given to you by a woman in the woods, you were punished. The church wasn't the only force at play. Local lords and city councils also began issuing bans on specific herbs. In parts of Germany, in the Low Countries, the sale of mandrake root without a physician's note was criminalized. In some English towns, dried poppy flowers were classified as contraband unless distributed by guild-approved apothecaries. These bans weren't always about health, they were about control. When people can slip into euphoria, forget pain, dream outside the rules, it threatens the rigid order of medieval life. The hierarchy depended on obedience, fear, and spiritual discipline. Substances that opened other doors, doors of pleasure, creativity, rebellion, had to be labeled as dangerous. And so we see a growing trend, clamp down and classification. Healers became suspects. Folk traditions were painted as devilish. Herbs once used to bless babies were now whispered about as tools of Satan. And the people who continued using them, especially women, bore the brunt of suspicion. By the dawn of the early modern period, the seeds were sown for the full-scale witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries. But before that tide rose, there was still a quiet hum in the hedgerows. People still brewed their teas, still rubbed strange ointments onto sore limbs, still drifted into altered sleep with the scent of mugwort on their pillows. They weren't witches, they were simply human, curious, tired, in pain, seeking relief or revelation in a world full of darkness and noise. And so, in our next and final part, we'll draw this long dream to a close. We'll see how these medieval practices shaped modern understandings of drugs, medicine, and madness. We'll walk through how 21st century minds are rediscovering what 13th century herbalists already knew. And we'll end with a few reflections on what it really meant to get high, when the world around you believed that heaven and hell were only one breath away. But for now, rest. Let the flickering candlelight of the past lull you. And remember, even in the most rigid times, someone, somewhere, was leaning back under a tree, eyes half closed, feeling just a little different. The candle burns low now, the wine has long since cooled, and somewhere beyond the monastery walls, an owl lets out its slow, lonely call to the moon. You've wandered far with us, through gardens of strange herbs, down corridors of sacred silence, across the dangerous bridges between medicine, mysticism, and suspicion. But we're not quite finished. Tonight, in this last chapter, let's look at how these medieval experiences, of dreams stirred by herbs, of visions awakened by prayer or potion, echoed long after the Middle Ages ended. Let's follow the thread into the early modern world, where ancient knowledge was broken apart, rewritten, and rediscovered. By the late 1400s, the printing press had begun to change everything. Before then, knowledge passed slowly, by word of mouth, by secret recipe, by handwritten scroll. But suddenly, anyone who could read could learn the old ways. Herbals, books listing the properties of plants, exploded in popularity. One of the most famous, De Materia Medica, had been written over 1,000 years earlier by a Greek physician. Now it was in Latin, printed and bound, sitting on the shelves of apothecaries and scholars from London to Prague. It contained page after page describing herbs like mandrake, wormwood, poppy, and henbane, not in poetic whispers, but in confident medical prose. Yet reading about these plants was not the same as understanding them, because even as the Renaissance bloomed and the language of science began to replace superstition, there was still no firm line between healing and dreaming. Let's take the example of mandrake, again. Artists of the 1500s and 1600s still drew it with limbs, like a person hiding in the roots. Its cries were still feared, but its effects were still sought. Physicians prescribed it for toothaches, insomnia, and melancholy. But in the wrong amounts, or in unskilled hands, it could still send people slipping into deep, echoing sleep filled with shapes and voices. Meanwhile, across Europe, a strange balance emerged. On one hand, universities and official guilds tried to standardize what was safe, what was proper, what could be written down in ledgers and taxed. On the other, the countryside, the mountains, the bogs, the forests, still hummed with older ways. Women, especially older women, continued passing recipes to daughters, nieces, apprentices. Some mixtures were for healing bruises or easing childbirth. Others were for guiding the mind into softened, shifted states of awareness. These women were often feared. The term cunning woman appears again and again in records from the 1500s onward. They were respected when their work succeeded, and blamed when it didn't. A fever cured earned a coin. A fever worsened brought a knock on the door from the local bailiff, and that fear only grew. As European nations expanded their reach overseas, they encountered new plants, brought back from the Americas, Africa, and Asia. Tobacco, for example, arrived in Europe in the 16th century and quickly spread across social classes. Its use was often ritualized, smoked in churchyards, sniffed in salons, offered at feasts. People described it as calming, as enlightening, as lifting the vapors of bad thoughts. Others worried it dulled the mind or opened it too much. Likewise, explorers returned with tales of substances used by indigenous cultures in sacred ceremonies, substances that could provoke visions, dreams, or strange serenity. European scholars were both fascinated and horrified. They couldn't decide if these rituals were savage superstition or glimpses of deeper, older wisdom. Back home, suspicion turned inward again. In the 1600s and 1700s, witch trials spread like fire across England, Germany, and colonial America. Many accused women, often healers or midwives, were charged with using potions or ointments to control others. Some of these substances, when tested centuries later, revealed active ingredients capable of influencing mood, awareness, and memory. But in their time, they were treated not as medicine or curiosity, but as evidence of evil. There's a bitter irony there, that the same knowledge once used to ease pain or quiet a restless mind became, in the eyes of judges and clergy, a threat to the soul. And yet, the knowledge survived. It went underground, hidden in folk songs, preserved in notebooks passed from one quiet hand to another, tucked between the pages of cookbooks or pressed into the margins of religious texts. By the 18th century, science began reaching out to reclaim it. Botanists and physicians began cataloging again, this time with microscopes, measurements, and experiments. They confirmed what midwives and monks had known for centuries, that certain plants could soften suffering and shift perception. But the question always lingered, why did some people seek that shift? For pain relief, yes, for sleep, but also, still always, for something else. A sense of connection, a spiritual touch, a break from the crushing grind of daily life. In a world lit only by fire, when winters were long and death sudden, to feel lightness, to feel vision, was a precious and sometimes dangerous thing. That brings us back, finally, to one last story. It's late in the 14th century. The plague has come and gone, twice. A small village in the Italian Alps holds a quiet festival in the spring, marking the survival of their children. As part of the ritual, each family brings a small bundle of herbs to burn in the town square. Among the smoke, there's rosemary, sage, and lavender. But one old woman brings a different bundle, mugwort, a sacred herb in many traditions, used to protect travelers and stir dreams. As it burns, she hums a tune, low, steady. Children sit near her. One later writes, decades afterward, that he saw the stars blinking down even though it was noon, that he felt warm though the spring wind was cold, that he dreamed while awake. Nothing happened to the woman, no trial, no accusation. Perhaps in that mountain village, what she did was still seen for what it was, old wisdom, a glimpse into the soft places between waking and sleep. And so, here we are. Centuries later, we lie under electric lights, but the questions remain the same. How do we rest? How do we heal? What do we seek in those quiet moments when the world fades and something else rises? The medieval world didn't separate these things the way we do now. They understood that pain, sleep, dreams, vision, and ritual were all twined together. They didn't always have the language we have, but they had experience, and memory, and story. And tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you carry a little of that with you. Somewhere, a bell chimes midnight across a distant field. Somewhere, a breeze stirs the dry leaves of an old plant growing wild by a stone wall. And somewhere, maybe in your own heart, there's a flicker of that old desire, not just to rest, but to dream a little deeper than before. Tonight's story might sound like a trip to the salon, but trust me, it's more like time travel through identity, status, and rebellion. We're talking ancient hairstyles, not just how people wore their hair, but what it meant, how it shaped who they were, and why losing a braid could mean losing your honor. So fluff your pillow and settle in, because things are about to get tangled. When we think of the ancient world, we usually imagine columns, chariots, gods throwing lightning, and the occasional toga party. But beneath the marble and mythology, daily life was rich in quiet rituals and subtle signs, and one of the most powerful, strangely enough, was hair. Hair was never just hair. It was a living banner of identity, carefully sculpted to whisper or shout things like gender, age, rank, religion, grief, pride, and power. To us today, a haircut might just be a Tuesday, but for someone in ancient Egypt or Rome, cutting your hair could mean a transformation of the self, or exile, or mourning, or marriage. So let's brush back the centuries and begin with one of the most style-conscious civilizations to ever grace the earth, ancient Egypt. If you've ever seen a statue of an Egyptian noble, you've likely noticed the sleek, geometric precision of their hair, whether real or false. Hair in ancient Egypt was about more than looking good. It was sacred, symbolic, and strictly coded. Children, regardless of class, were often shaved bald except for one or two side locks known as the side lock of youth. This wasn't a whimsical fashion choice, it was religious. That little tuft of hair was a mark of youth and purity, and even associated with the child god Horus. So until puberty, your hair was essentially a devotional badge. As people aged, their hairstyles matured with them. Adult men typically kept their heads either shaved or cropped very short, partly for hygiene, lice was not a vibe, and partly for symbolic cleanliness. Wigs made from human hair were worn for formal occasions, and these were no Party City leftovers. Egyptian wigs were carefully crafted masterpieces, often layered, curled, and scented with waxes and myrrh. Women had more variety. They could wear their natural hair or don intricate wigs styled into elaborate coils, braids, and ringlets. These weren't just signs of beauty, they marked class and devotion. A high-status woman's wig might weigh several pounds and be topped with a cone of perfumed animal fat that slowly melted down into the hair during banquets, releasing fragrance as the night went on. Ancient glamour with a side of mess. And yet, for all the vanity, hair in Egypt was deeply intertwined with mortality. Hair was carefully tended on mummies, sometimes even dyed or decorated posthumously. In the Book of the Dead, hair is referenced in spells for resurrection. A bad hair day might ruin a selfie, but in ancient Egypt it could complicate your afterlife. Jump across the Mediterranean, and we land in ancient Greece, where hair had its own social logic. In early Greece, especially during the Archaic period, long hair on men was associated with aristocracy, youth, and heroism. Think Homeric warriors, wind-blown and fabulous. Achilles didn't just rage in the Iliad, he had a flowing mane of hair to go with it. But as Greek society became more structured, hair became more politically loaded. During the classical era, citizens of Athens kept their hair relatively short and tidy. A messy head suggested a messy mind, or worse, a foreign influence. Young boys often had long hair until a coming-of-age ceremony called the Kurain, where they cut it off and dedicated it to a god, usually Apollo. This was a spiritual and social pivot. Your locks went to the heavens, and you were expected to start acting like a responsible citizen. No pressure. Women's hairstyles were intricate and conservative. Long, elaborately styled hair was the norm, often tied up in braids or held in place with ribbons and diadems. A woman's hair was considered both erotic and private. Worn loose in public, that could mean you were mourning, or that you were a courtesan. Context was everything. And then there were the Spartans, who, predictably, did things a bit differently. Spartan men wore their hair long as a badge of military excellence. Long hair adds beauty to a handsome face and terror to an ugly one, said the Spartan lawgiver Lycurgus, allegedly. For them, grooming was part of the warrior ethos. They combed their hair before battle, not for vanity, but as a ritual of readiness. If you were going to die, you might as well look the part. Let's now comb our way into Rome. In Republican Rome, hair reflected the Roman ideals of gravitas, discipline, and control. Simplicity was virtue. For men, that meant short, no-nonsense styles. Hair was clipped regularly, beards were mostly out of style, and excessive grooming was considered a Greek affectation, fancy, foreign, and just a bit suspicious. But by the time we reach the empire, all bets are off. The hairstyles of Roman emperors, especially after Nero, become increasingly elaborate, mirroring the excess of the imperial court. Think curled fringes, sculpted layers, and styles that required a small army of slaves known as tonsors and ornitresses, hairdressers, to maintain. Some emperors even wore wigs, especially when age or stress thinned their natural hair, a Roman toupee, if you will. Roman women, though, were the undisputed queens of hair architecture. By the Flavian era, 1st century CE, aristocratic women wore hairstyles so elaborate that they seemed to defy gravity. Towering masses of curls were coiled and pinned into sculptural feats that made modern beehives look like child's play. These weren't just vanity projects, they were political. A woman's hair was a public performance of her wealth, virtue, and lineage. The more intricate the style, the more slaves it took to build it, and the more status it projected. A well-coiffed Roman matron was like a walking social resume, but not everyone bought into the curling craze. Stoics like Seneca wrote scathing critiques of hair obsession, warning that too much time in front of a mirror was a symptom of moral rot. Still, the styles kept growing higher. Hair also played a role in Roman rites of passage. Like the Greeks, Roman boys had a ceremonial first haircut called the tonsura, and would often dedicate the clippings to the gods. Girls had similar moments tied to marriage, where letting down their hair signaled a shift in role and responsibility. So far, we've talked about styles, rituals, and social cues, but we haven't yet touched on one of the oldest and most globally significant dimensions of hair: control. Because across many ancient cultures, cutting someone's hair wasn't just grooming, it was punishment. Conquest, humiliation, or even slavery could be marked by the shearing of hair. It was a symbolic stripping of identity, agency, and power. If your hair told the world who you were, then having it forcibly removed meant being erased. And yet, sometimes the opposite was true. People used hairstyles to resist, to reclaim, and to signal defiance. Hair could be beautiful, it could be noble, it could even be sacred, but in the ancient world, hair could also be dangerous. Let's start with a scene of rebellion, not with swords or shields, but with scissors, or rather, the lack of them. In many ancient cultures, especially those living under occupation or facing conquest, hair became a quiet form of resistance. When outside rulers imposed rules, dress codes, languages, taxes, the people often turned to subtle acts of defiance. One of the most potent? Wearing their hair in traditional styles that the occupiers couldn't erase. Take the ancient Israelites. In the book of Judges, we meet Samson, a man whose strength was bound to his uncut hair. The story is heavy with symbolism. His hair is a sacred vow to God, and when it's shaved by Delilah, he loses not just his power, but his identity. In a sense, it's not just a haircut, it's a desecration. And though the story is mythic, it reflects a deeper truth. In the ancient Near East, hair could carry religious and national meaning. Samson's uncut locks were part of the Nazirite vow, a commitment made by some men and women to devote themselves to spiritual purity. No alcohol, no corpses, and no razors. Their hair grew wild as a visible reminder of divine dedication. To cut it was to break the covenant. The idea of sacred hair wasn't unique to the Israelites. In Vedic India, long hair signified renunciation. Hindu ascetics, or sadhus, often let their hair grow into thick, matted dreadlocks known as jata. These weren't symbols of neglect, they were visible rejections of worldly vanity. Hair was offered not to society, but to the gods. The goddess Shiva is often depicted with wild flowing locks, containing within them the sacred river Ganges. His hair holds back a flood, both literal and metaphorical. It's the dam between chaos and order, and in that symbolism we see how hair, when left untamed, could suggest not disorder, but deeper control. Let's cross over to ancient China, where Confucian ideals shaped not only thought and behavior, but also grooming. In Confucian philosophy, your body is a gift from your parents, and altering it, cutting it, tattooing it, was seen as a form of disrespect. Hair, nails, skin, all should remain intact. This principle, known as Shenti Fufa, made cutting one's hair a serious matter. In fact, it's part of the reason why ancient Chinese men wore their hair long, often coiled into top knots. The top knot wasn't just a style, it was a statement. It said, "I honor my ancestors, I preserve what was given to me." But with the rise and fall of dynasties, hair again became political. When the Manchu established the Qing dynasty in the 17th century, they imposed a new rule. All Han Chinese men had to shave the front of their heads and braid the rest into a queue. This wasn't just a new hairstyle, it was a forced cultural symbol of submission to the new rulers. Refusal to adopt the style was punished with death, so hair, once a sign of filial piety, now became a battleground for identity. To keep your hair was to rebel, to cut it was to survive. This isn't just ancient history. The tension between tradition and imposed conformity echoes through time. From Native American boarding schools in the 19th century, where indigenous children were forcibly shorn, to modern debates over hair in workplaces and schools. But let's travel back further, to the Celts. The ancient Celts, especially those living in what's now Ireland and Scotland, had a unique relationship with their hair. Warriors often wore their hair long and wild, spiked with lime to create dramatic styles that struck fear into their enemies. Roman soldiers wrote about these terrifying figures, with their untamed hair and painted faces charging into battle like spirits of nature itself. To the Romans, they were barbarians. To themselves, they were free. Hair, in this context, wasn't vanity, it was warfare. It made you larger than life, made your enemies doubt, made your ancestors proud. And when the Romans finally conquered Celtic lands, one of the first things they did was enforce Roman grooming standards. Short hair, clean shave, tidy, manageable, controllable. Order. But not everyone could be tamed. Let's pause and take a breath. Feel the air around you, the stillness. Imagine sitting by firelight in an ancient village, braiding someone's hair as an act of care, ritual, maybe even resistance. Now let's talk about gender. Hair wasn't just a marker of ethnicity or religion. It also helped define masculinity and femininity, though those definitions varied wildly depending on where and when you were. In ancient Assyria, men were expected to have thick, luxurious beards, not just grown, but sculpted, carefully oiled, curled, and perfumed. Beards were a sign of virility and authority, and palace art often depicts kings with beards that reach their chests in intricate waves. Women, on the other hand, wore their hair long but covered. Uncovered hair, in many ancient Middle Eastern cultures, was considered improper or immodest. To appear with your hair exposed might mean one of two things. You were grieving, or you were making a statement. In ancient Mesopotamia, priestesses sometimes wore their hair differently from other women. Some shaved their heads, others braided it in sacred patterns. In either case, hairstyle marked their special status, separate from both married women and unmarried girls. Hair could also become a metaphor. In Greek mythology, Medusa's snaky head of hair wasn't just a horror. It was a statement about female rage, sexuality, and transformation. She turned men to stone, not in spite of her hair, but because of it. The symbol is rich with interpretations from feminist readings to psychoanalysis, but one thing is clear, her hair made her more than mortal. Let's now glide into ancient Africa, particularly Nubia and early Ethiopia, where braiding and coiling techniques were elevated into high art. In these regions, hair was a communal affair. Braiding could take hours and often required the help of friends or family. It wasn't just grooming, it was bonding, storytelling, oral history woven into each twist and turn. Hair expressed not only beauty, but clan, status, spiritual beliefs, even mood. Archaeologists have uncovered Nubian graves where the deceased were buried with ornate wigs, hairpins, and combs, objects meant to help them maintain dignity in the afterlife. This tells us something powerful. Your hair and how you wore it mattered not just in life, but beyond. And in many African societies, hair was tied to cosmology. Patterns echoed natural elements, rivers, stars, crops. Some styles were seasonal. Others marked age groups, like rites of passage for young girls becoming women. Hair was a map of the self. But what happens when that map is forcibly redrawn? Throughout history, colonization, slavery, and empire, all left their marks not just on lands and borders, but on bodies. And hair was often the first target. In ancient times, when people were captured and enslaved, their heads were frequently shaved as a sign of ownership and dehumanization. It was a stripping of identity, a removal of memory, a forced blank slate. And yet, over and over again, people found ways to reclaim their hair. Sometimes in secret, sometimes in ritual, sometimes through sheer persistence. Because even when hair was taken, the memory of its meaning remained. Let's end this part with one last example, perhaps a quiet one. In the ruins of Pompeii, preserved by volcanic ash, archaeologists discovered a small wooden box belonging to a Roman woman. Inside were hairpins, a comb, and a mirror. It was her travel kit, portable beauty, portable identity. She may have died in a disaster, but her tools of self-expression survived, locked in time. And so we begin to see that in every age and every culture, hair wasn't just an accessory, it was autobiography. Let's drift now from rebellion and empire to something gentler, rituals of care, ancient beauty routines, and the surprising science behind them. Because in every ancient civilization, no matter how grand or humble, hair was tended to with a devotion that might surprise you. And sometimes the process was as symbolic as it was aesthetic. Take, for example, ancient Egypt. The climate was hot, the desert unforgiving, and the social hierarchy rigid. But even so, the Egyptians mastered the art of personal grooming. They didn't just care about hair, they revered it. And when they didn't have it, they created it. You see, wigs in ancient Egypt weren't just for disguise or status, they were essential attire, made from human hair, palm fibers, or wool, and stiffened with beeswax or resin. Wigs were often worn over shaved scalps, not because baldness was fashionable, but because it was practical. Shaving the head helped keep lice away and the body cool, but once cleansed, the head was adorned again with a full, elaborate style. Egyptian wigs weren't chaotic masses. They followed specific styles based on social class and gender. The wealthiest citizens had their wigs perfumed and curled, often with ornamental beads, gold wires, or ivory pins. Both men and women wore them. Some were short and geometrical, others long, braided, and flowing. And yes, they had products too. Ancient Egyptians used a variety of natural oils. Castor, almond, and moringa oil were especially popular to condition their hair and wigs. Henna was applied for coloring, lending a reddish tint that signified vitality and youth. Hair also had ties to the afterlife. In tombs, wig boxes were placed alongside the dead. Combs, razors, hairpins, all included in the burial kit. It wasn't just vanity, it was preparation. Because in the afterlife, as in life, you needed to look your part. Now shift to ancient India, where the daily ritual of oiling the hair became a moment of peace, a gesture of love, and sometimes a spiritual practice. Indian women and men used coconut oil, amla, neem, and other herbs to nourish their scalps. This wasn't merely cosmetic, it was part of Ayurveda, an ancient holistic medical system that viewed hair as an indicator of bodily health. If your hair was dry or falling out, it wasn't just a bad hair day. It was a sign something deeper was out of balance. Oiling the hair also had a social dimension. Mothers and grandmothers passed it down as a family ritual, sitting under a tree or near a window, gently working oil into someone's scalp, combing through tangles. These were intimate acts, wordless and comforting, generations braided together by practice. In certain Indian traditions, shaving the head marked a turning point in life. After a death in the family, men often shaved their heads in mourning. Children, too, went through a ritual known as munching, a ceremonial first haircut said to cleanse the past life energies carried from birth. Hair, in this context, wasn't just identity, it was karma. But let's leave the warmth of that courtyard and float over to ancient Greece, where things were both philosophical and fashionable. Greek men were particular about their beards and hair. Beards were a mark of wisdom and manhood, but not unkempt ones. The Greeks invented razors around the 6th century BCE, and grooming became a symbol of civilization. To be clean-shaven was to be refined. Alexander the Great famously encouraged his soldiers to shave so their beards couldn't be grabbed in battle, a practical decision that sparked a widespread trend. For women, hairstyles evolved from the simple to the sensational. In early periods, a loose chignon or knot at the back of the head was common, secured with ivory pins or woven bands. Later, especially among the elite, styles grew more elaborate, braids wrapped around the head, curled fringes, and even the use of false hair. What's especially fascinating is that hair in Greece wasn't just about appearance, it marked life's passages. When young boys reached adulthood, they offered a lock of hair to the gods, often Apollo, in a coming-of-age ceremony. Women, too, would dedicate hair before marriage or after childbirth. Hair was a gift, cut in sacrifice, left at temples, offered with prayer. There's something poetic about that a simple strand of hair could carry your intentions, your hopes, your devotion. In Roman society, hair took on a different kind of grandeur, especially among women of high status. Roman noble women were obsessed with intricate hairstyles. The more elaborate, the higher your rank. Think towering buns, cascading ringlets, rows of tight braids, all secured with golden pins, woven with pearls, or dusted with perfumed powder. And they had help. Wealthy women employed slaves called ornatrices, personal hairdressers who were trained in elaborate styles. Inscriptions and art even depict these women at work, their hands weaving through complicated patterns like artists with a living canvas. The Roman poet Ovid gave instructions for charming hairstyles in his work Ars Amatoria, reminding us that beauty and hair was considered a fine art. And Roman men weren't left out. Barbershops, or tonsustrini, became central parts of male culture, like modern cafes or salons. But even the most fabulous style came with risk. Wigs were popular, especially ones made from blonde hair imported from Germanic tribes. Wearing the hair of your conquered enemies? That was a statement, and a little creepy. Still, hair had political weight in Rome. Emperors were expected to project idealized appearances. Augustus's neatly combed locks appeared on coins as a symbol of order. Nero's more flamboyant styles reflected his ego and excess. And Caligula? His thinning hair was such a sore point, he banned anyone from standing above him. Hair, in a way, became propaganda. Let's now take a step into ritual shaving, because while much of this journey has been about styling, sometimes the act of removal was the most sacred of all. In ancient Buddhist traditions, monks and nuns shaved their heads completely upon ordination. This wasn't a punishment, it was a shedding of ego, attachment, and vanity. The smooth scalp was a symbol of humility and renunciation. Even today, in many Buddhist cultures, children entering temporary monastic life go through the ritual of head shaving. Each snip is symbolic, cutting away ignorance, desire, pride. The shorn head becomes a blank slate, a vessel for learning and clarity. And in Japan, during the Heian period, aristocratic women had quite the opposite practice. They grew their hair as long as possible, sometimes down to their knees or ankles. The style was called subarakashi, and it was meant to be worn loose and flowing, like silk. Hair care became a daily ritual of combing, perfuming, and admiration. But style shifted in later periods, especially among samurai women. More structured styles with waxed buns and pins came into fashion. A woman's hair reflected her rank, her family's status, and even her marital availability. And once married, she might shave part of her eyebrows and alter her hairstyle entirely to reflect her new role. Hair in that world was as revealing as a passport. Now back to Africa, where hairstyling reached astonishing levels of craftsmanship. Among the Yoruba people of Nigeria, hair was believed to hold spiritual power, specifically the top of the head, called ori, which was considered a conduit to the divine. Hair was often braided into complex symbolic shapes, reflecting one's destiny, protection, or life path. It wasn't just beauty, it was theology. Some Yoruba hairstyles took hours, even days to complete, but the time wasn't seen as wasteful. It was sacred time, it was love, it was history passed from hand to hand. And then we find the Himba, women of Namibia, whose iconic red braids are coated with a paste of ochre, butter, and fragrant resins. The style isn't just stunning, it's protection against the harsh desert sun. And each style tells a story of age, of motherhood, of heritage. Hair was history, written daily, worn publicly, inherited proudly. Let's close this part with a quiet image. Picture an ancient wooden comb, smoothed by years of use. Perhaps it belonged to a girl who sat each evening as her mother gently worked through her knots, whispering stories, or to a young man preparing for a feast, oiling his curls with care. That comb, worn down by touch, was more than a tool. It was a keepsake, a memory, a connection. Hair may grow back, styles may change, but the care we give it, the rituals, the meanings, that's what remains. So far, we've wandered through temples, markets, bathhouses, and palaces, each place showing us how hair could express power, piety, desire, or tradition. But in this final part of our journey, we'll slow down and step into the more painful and sometimes more profound dimensions of ancient hair culture. Because in many ancient societies, hair wasn't just a canvas for beauty, it was a tool of control, a way to shame, to punish, or to mark grief. Let's start with the silence, the kind that follows a conquest. In the ancient world, when a city fell or an enemy was captured, one of the first acts of humiliation was the cutting of hair. Not a trim, not a style, but a brutal shearing meant to strip away dignity. The Greeks, for all their art and philosophy, practiced this often. Captive women, especially, had their hair hacked off in public. It was a way of branding them, of saying, you are no longer who you were. Their past was gone, their future uncertain. In art, you can sometimes see these women, head bowed, hair ragged, dignity stolen. Romans used a similar tactic. Enslaved people were routinely shaved as part of their processing. The loss of hair symbolized the loss of self. It erased identity. You were no longer a citizen, a mother, a merchant. You were a number, a thing. Even religious outcasts were marked this way. In some early Christian communities, those deemed heretics or possessed were forced to have their hair removed as part of exorcisms or public repentance. Hair, once a source of pride, became a signal of shame. But it wasn't just others doing the cutting. Sometimes people cut their own hair, or had it cut for them, as a sign of grief. In ancient Mesopotamia, for example, when someone died, family members would ritually tear at their hair, not symbolically, but literally. They pulled it out by the roots, a physical cry of sorrow. In Egypt, mourners shaved their eyebrows to honor the dead, and those were closely watched. When your brows grew back, the formal mourning period was considered complete. It was grief, measured in regrowth. The Romans again had their own customs. During funerals, women were expected to dishevel their hair, letting it fall wild and unpinned. It was a visual cue of heartbreak. Later, in private moments, they might cut locks from the deceased or themselves and place them in burial urns or lockets. Hair carried memory. It was a piece of the person you couldn't let go. One of the most haunting examples comes from China. In certain dynasties, women in mourning might remove their ornamental hair pieces or even let their hair grow unstyled and unwashed as a sign of devotion to the deceased. The act wasn't about physical appearance. It was about internal sorrow made visible. Sometimes entire heads were shaved when a ruler died. Courtiers, soldiers, even members of the public. It was a kind of collective grief, a nation's mourning turned visible. But what about when hair was tied not to death, but desire? In love, hair was often given as a token, a braid wrapped in ribbon, a lock tucked into a pouch. In Homer's Odyssey, Penelope dreams of her husband returning, and one of her memories is of him running his hands through her long hair, a tender echo of intimacy. In ancient Japan, during the Heian period, exchanging hair was considered deeply romantic. A lover might send a few strands in a scroll, scented and pressed, as a symbol of longing. No words, just hair, and all that it carried. Hair could be power, too. Witches, both real and imagined, were said to use strands of hair to curse or enchant. And so, even in fear, hair retained its mystical pull. Let's shift now to another kind of control. Institutional, enforced, political. In ancient China, under the Qing dynasty, all Han Chinese men were required to wear the queue, a long braid down the back with the front of the head shaved. It wasn't a traditional Han style, it was Manchu, and enforcing it was about dominance. Cutting your hair the wrong way could lead to execution. Keep your hair and lose your head, or keep your head and cut your hair, the saying went. This wasn't styling, it was submission. Other empires imposed hair restrictions to draw lines between classes, castes, or even races. In some places, enslaved people were forbidden from wearing certain styles. In others, only nobility could wear hair a certain length. These rules turned hair into a kind of passport, a way to signal who you were and who you could never be. But despite the rules, people found ways to resist. Among enslaved Africans in the Americas, traditional hairstyles like cornrows became not just cultural expressions, but maps. It's whispered that some braid patterns were used to signal escape routes or hide seeds for planting after freedom. Hair became survival. Hair became code. The same goes for Jewish prisoners in Nazi concentration camps. Heads were forcibly shaved, not for hygiene, but for dehumanization. But survivors later reclaimed the act. Growing hair back became a quiet victory, a way to say, I am still here. Hair was never just hair. Now think about identity, how even today we touch our hair when we're nervous, when we flirt, when we lie. It's an extension of us, and in ancient times it was a way of telling the world who we were, even when we couldn't say it aloud. Among the Celts, warriors often bleached and spiked their hair with lime. It wasn't about fashion, it was psychological warfare. A wild pale mane told enemies, I am not afraid to die. And then there are the Scythians, nomadic people from the Eurasian steppes. Their hairstyles are only partly preserved through art and burials, but we know that both men and women wore their hair long, often braided and decorated with gold or bone. The braid spoke of family lineage, tribal rank, and personal bravery. In Native American cultures, hair carried deep spiritual significance. Among the Lakota, for example, long hair was seen as a physical manifestation of one's spirit. Cutting it was done rarely. During times of mourning or major life shifts, hair connected the body to the soul. And what about in mythology? In the Bible, Samson's strength lived in his hair. Delilah cut it while he slept and he became weak. But when it began to grow again, so did his power. Whether you believe the story or not, the symbolism is potent. Hair as strength, hair as essence. In Norse mythology, Sif, wife of Thor, had hair made of gold, forged by dwarves after Loki mischievously cut it off. The story isn't just playful, it reinforces the idea that hair was divine, precious, worth mourning when lost. And maybe that's the quiet lesson behind all of this. Hair is often our first introduction to ourselves. We learn to brush it, wash it, style it. We obsess over it, we curse it, we use it to test boundaries and express freedom. But it also connects us to something older, something primal. It binds us to lineage, to mourning, to love, to belief. In the end, maybe that's why hair has mattered so much through time. Not because it grows or falls out, but because it says, without speaking, this is me. Not just now, but then. Not just here, but always. And as we close this story, imagine, if you will, the quiet snip of scissors, a strand falling to the floor, a lock tied with twine. Maybe it's a goodbye, maybe it's a keepsake. Either way, it matters. Sleep well. Picture this, a dusty sunrise over the Zagros Mountains, jackals still howling on the ridges, while a midwife in a goat hair tent whispers that the newborn in her arms will topple kings. That's the first breath of Cyrus, the child who will grow to be called great by Persians and Greeks alike. And tonight we're tracing every twist in his braid of fate. Cyrus's story begins not in polished palaces, but in a frontier village called Anshan, where the highlands of Persis meet the salt white deserts of Iran. His people, the Persians, were a hardy clan of herders and horse breeders overshadowed by their imperial neighbors, the Medes to the north and the Lydians to the west. Yet in Persian tents, elders stirred the embers of older legends, tales of a sun-haired hero named Kurush, who would knit scattered tribes into one beating heart. When Cyrus was born around 600 BCE, those campfire whispers gathered around his cradle like protective spirits. The first thread in his destiny came from a dream. King Astyages of Media, ruler of a realm stretching from the Black Sea to the Zagros passes, dreamed that his daughter Mandane would bear a son whose rule would eclipse his own. Shaken, Astyages married her off to Cambyses, a minor Persian king whom he considered safely insignificant. Yet prophecy is stubborn stuff. Mandane bore Cyrus, and court rumor-mongers carried news of the child back to Ecbatana, the Median capital. Astyages, jittery under his jeweled crown, ordered the infant killed. He handed the task to his steward Harpagus, who in turn passed the grim order to a cowherd, Mithridates, living on the steppe slopes. But Mithridates' wife had just lost her own baby. She convinced her husband to spare the Persian child and bury their dead infant in its place. Thus, Cyrus grew up a shepherd prince, learning to wrestle mountain lions of necessity, cold, hunger, and the suspicion that the world beyond the valley was waiting for him. Legends say he showed his mettle early, playing king with village boys, Cyrus commanded them like a natural general, meting out chores and punishments. When word of his games reached Astyages, the king recognized royal timber in the boy's bearing and demanded he be brought to court. There, amid stone columns and peacock frescoes, prophecy stood face to face with paranoia. Counselors persuaded Astyages that fate could not be strangled. Better to tolerate the boy as a hostage than risk angering the gods. So Cyrus was educated in Median etiquette, archery, riding, and the art of speaking softly while planning boldly. Iron sharpening iron beneath turquoise ceilings. But the true forging happened back in Persia. In his teens, Cyrus returned south to Anshan, greeting his father Cambyses like dawn greeting the dark. He listened to elders complain of Median taxes and swaggering governors. He watched caravans from Lydia, their camels' backs bent under gold ingots, bypass Persian markets because toll collectors favored Media, and he felt the first heat of purpose rising behind his ribs. Cyrus gathered chiefs around simple fires, not marble halls. He promised something startling for the age: rule based on respect rather than plunder, cooperation rather than coercion. It wasn't idealism, it was strategy. The Persians were outnumbered and outarmed. Unity was their strongest arrow. Village by village, clan by clan, Cyrus turned oaths into steel. Harpagus, the very steward who had once spared his life, now served at Astyages' table, and secretly smoldered with resentment. Astyages had punished him years earlier for the infant deception, forcing him to consume his own son's flesh at a banquet. Revenge brewed like sour wine. Through coded letters hidden inside hare carcasses, ancient espionage is nothing if not creative. Harpagus encouraged Cyrus to revolt. Betrayal cracked the Median shield from within. Battle came on the plains of Pasargadae. Median cavalry, glittering with scale armor, thundered against Persian levies clad in felt and hope. But Cyrus wielded tactics like a smith wields a hammer. He dispersed his archers into staggered lines, broke the enemy's charge with pliant ranks that bent but did not break, and exploited the confusion when Harpagus' divisions accidentally turned the wrong way. After 3 brutal days, Astyages fled, and the Median banner, once a symbol of unassailable power, fluttered at Cyrus's feet. Here most conquerors would drink themselves silly on victory wine. Cyrus did something subtler. He married diplomacy to triumph. He spared Astyages, honored Median nobles, and proclaimed a single joint realm, Media Persia. Instead of razing Ecbatana, he filled its treasuries with Persian riches and opened its gates to traders of every tongue. Loyalty, he understood, can be bought with mercy as surely as with coin. Word spread like hoofbeats across Anatolia. To the west, King Croesus of Lydia, he of legendary wealth, grew nervous. He consulted the oracle at Delphi, which told him that if he marched east, he would destroy a great empire. Croesus, hearing what he wanted, marched. Winter snows stalled him at the Halys River. Cyrus, ever the wolf circling the campfire, seized initiative, crossing icy waters on pontoon bridges and cornering Croesus at Thimbra. Persian camel corps spooked the Lydian horses. Arrows darkened the pale winter sun. Lydia fell, and with it, the gold mints of Sardis. The prophecy came true, just not the way Croesus imagined. Again Cyrus tempered conquest with clemency. He placed a hand on Croesus' shoulder, sparing his life and retaining him as advisor. Greek city-states along the Aegean coast, Miletus, Phocaea, and Ephesus, witnessed this pragmatism and weighed rebellion against the softer yoke of Persian satraps. Many chose terms over turmoil. Cyrus's genius wasn't merely martial, it was organizational. He divided his swelling realm into provinces called satrapies, each overseen by a governor accountable directly to the king. Persian couriers, angaros, rode a network of royal roads carrying tablets faster than rumor. Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night. The famous motto of later postal systems traces its ancestry to these relentless riders. Eastward lay Babylon, jewel of Mesopotamia, ruled by Nabonidus but effectively run by his son Belshazzar. The empire's priests grumbled. Nabonidus favored the moon god Sin over Marduk, Babylon's patron. Merchants grumbled, taxes bit like sand vipers. Soldiers grumbled, pay was late. Cyrus listened. In 539 BCE, he marched along the Tigris. defeating Babylonian forces at Opis. Then, in a stroke of engineering audacity, his men diverted the Euphrates into marshes, lowering the river enough to wade under the city walls. Babylon, believing itself impregnable, awoke to Persian standards flying above its ziggurats. Yet the real masterstroke came after the gates swung open. Cyrus proclaimed freedom of worship, ordered sanctuaries restored, and returned confiscated idols to their temples. The famous Cyrus Cylinder records his decree that exiled peoples, most notably the Jews carried off by Nebuchadnezzar, could return home and rebuild. In a world of tyrants gouging tribute, Cyrus presented himself as a liberator. Empires are usually feared, rarely are they loved. Cyrus inched toward that impossible middle. Still, empire is a hungry creature, and the steppes of Central Asia called. Scythian horse archers roved beyond the Oxus River, raiding caravans and testing Persian frontiers. Cyrus led his veterans against the Massagetæ, whose queen Tomyris commanded warriors as fierce as any in myth. Accounts diverge. Herodotus paints a bloody tableau where Cyrus dies after capturing Tomyris' son. Persian chronicles hint he fell later in distant battles. What is certain? Somewhere amid those windswept plains, the man who reshaped half the known world met his end around 530 BCE. His body was carried to Pasargadae and laid in a modest limestone tomb, an angular house atop 6 steps, guarded by gardens of cypress and pomegranate. An inscription, simple and searing, was said to read, "O man, whoever you are and wherever you come from, I am Cyrus who won the Persians their empire. Do not begrudge me this small piece of earth that covers my body. Small piece of earth, a vast shadow of legacy." Under his son Cambyses II and later Darius I, Persia would stretch from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River, from the steppes to the cataracts of the Nile. Yet the blueprint, the blend of tolerance, infrastructure, and swift justice, was Cyrus's alone. So as our lantern burns low and the fan hum fades into desert wind, remember this: greatness isn't always loud. Sometimes it wears a shepherd's cloak, listens before it strikes, spares when it could scorch, and leaves behind an echo far larger than a tomb of stone. A low pink dawn warmed the limestone steps of Cyrus's tomb as riders gathered in the courtyard below, their breath frosting in the spring chill. News had come that Cambyses, the eldest son, would mount the throne. Persians whispered pride and trepidation in the same hushed sentences, pride at a native prince continuing the new order, unease because no one, not even Cambyses himself, had stood long enough in his father's shadow to measure it. Yet the rituals waited for no hesitation. The priests of Pasargadae anointed him with sacred water from the river Cyrus had diverted years before, the clear stream reflecting sky colors like liquid turquoise. Musicians blew slow notes on reed pipes. A bull was sacrificed, its blood pooling in silver bowls meant to seal the bond between heaven and earth. For a year Cambyses ruled from the steppes of Persepolis, holding court beneath striped awnings while satraps recited tax ledgers and frontier captains knelt with dust-crusted boots. But Cambyses' gaze drifted west toward Egypt, the only great kingdom not yet woven into the Persian tapestry. Egypt's pharaoh Amasis still wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, and at Memphis incense smoke carried prayers to gods with falcon heads and ibis beaks. Cambyses brooded over maps, hearing his father's admonition that empire, like a carpet, frays at the edges if left unfinished. Conquest, he decided, was maintenance. Winter of 526 BCE, camel caravans crossed the Syrian desert, bearing shields of rawhide and arrow shafts wrapped to keep the feathers straight. Cambyses marched at their rear, a king riding not in a litter of gold, but on a tall Nicaean stallion, the color of midnight. At Gaza, he met his allies, Cypriot sailors and Arab chieftains who offered skins of water from their wells. Without those wells, the army would parch before reaching the Nile. With them, the path opened like a blue thread across pale sand. Egypt fought in paints and omens. Pharaoh Psamtik III, Amasis' young successor, lined his front with bronze-crested hoplites hired from the Aegean and war chariots lacquered green as papyrus swamps. At Pelusium, the two armies faced each other under a bleached sky. Legend says Cambyses ordered his men to paint sacred Egyptian animals, cats, ibises, even tiny images of Bastet on their shields, knowing Egyptians feared harming creatures holy to their gods. Whether trick or truth, panic rippled through Pharaoh's ranks. Arrows hissed, dust swallowed daylight. By evening, Persian banners snapped over dunes piled with splintered spears, and Pelusium belonged to Cambyses. Memphis held out longer. Its white-walled fortress rose from a bend of the river like a maze of baked moonlight. Cambyses laid siege, surrounding the city with wicker screens, building battering rams taller than date palms. When defenders begged for parley, Cambyses promised clemency if they surrendered the Apis bull, a calf believed to incarnate Ptah. Memphis capitulated. Cambyses entered the temple barefooted in token respect, touching the calf's flank with fingers that trembled despite his iron will. Conquerors may break armies, but belief can unsettle even kings. Egypt was annexed not by massacre but by decree. Cambyses kept local priests in office, allowed hieroglyphs to continue dancing across stone, and even adopted the title Masutira to flatter the sun god. Yet his temper, sharp as desert glass, soon cracked the veneer. Stories filtered back to Persia. Cambyses mocked sacred rituals, stabbed a calf in rage, and opened royal tombs looking for hidden gold. Some called him mad, others slandered him to curry favor with rivals, but the effect was the same. The ripples in the mirror, still surface Cyrus had worked so hard to polish. Most troubling were rumors about Bardia, Cambyses' younger brother. Some said Cambyses had left him in Susa as regent. Others whispered that jealousy had driven Cambyses to secretly order Bardia's death before departing for Egypt. Months passed. The royal road echoed with speculation louder than hoofbeats. Then, one summer dawn, heralds announced a new proclamation. Bardia, alive and well, had seized the throne in the capital, freeing subjects from military levies and slashing taxes by half. Persia exhaled in relief, too swiftly, because a second rumor followed the first like thunder after lightning. This Bardia was not the real prince, but an impostor, a Magian priest named Gaumata who resembled him closely enough to fool the court. Cambyses, hurrying home through Syrian wastelands, wounded his thigh in a freak accident while mounting his horse. The wound festered. Somewhere near Hamadan, beneath a sky of searing blue, Cambyses died, his last command lost on the hot wind. Do not suffer the Magus to live. 7 nobles met by torchlight to decide the empire's fate. Among them was Darius, son of Hystaspes, a tall man with hawk eyes and a soldier's crisp bearing. They agreed to strike the impostor. That night they stormed Bardia's stronghold, blades flashing in oil lamp gloom, and slew him, real or fake. History still debates. When morning lifted the haze, the nobles gathered again, arguing how to legitimize their coup. Some proposed oligarchy, others pure monarchy. Darius spoke last, invoking Ahura Mazda and the righteousness of a single, just king who would answer to heaven but consult the wise. The others nodded, part faith, part exhaustion. They placed the crown on his head and called him King of Kings. Darius began not with conquest but with ink. He inscribed his lineage on a mountainside at Behistun, carving words in 3 languages so no ear in his patchwork empire could claim ignorance. The relief depicts Darius towering over bound rebels, foot upon the chest of Gaumata, divine Faravahar hovering above like a guardian flame. The chisel strokes established a narrative. Darius had restored order, defeated lies, and was the chosen of the gods. Propaganda, yes, but also blueprint. Where Cyrus united and Cambyses expanded, Darius would organize. First he quelled revolts flickering across the realm. Elam, Babylonia, even provinces in faraway Bactria tested his mettle. Each uprising he crushed fast, then rebuilt faster, planting garrisons like seeds along the royal road, and appointing satraps balanced by royal inspectors, the eyes and ears of the king. Coinage was standardized into gold derricks stamped with the image of the king drawing a bow. Weight systems were aligned. Canal projects dredged the Nile to the Red Sea, and caravanserais sprouted along trade arteries, offering safety, water, and gossip. But greatness is restless, and the edges of the map still glimmered with temptation. Across the Bosporus, the Greek city-states of Ionia simmered under Persian rule. They paid taxes, yet sang praises to freedom. In 499 BCE, Miletus flared into open rebellion, aided by Athens and Eretria. Darius saw not a local brushfire but a breach in cosmic order. He marched west, crossing the Hellespont on pontoon bridges cunningly anchored by flax cables. At Marathon, his generals faltered against hoplite discipline, but the defeat was a dagger prick, not a mortal wound. Darius swore by the rising sun to punish Athens. A servant was ordered to whisper, "Remember the Athenians," in his ear at every feast. While fleets assembled, Darius turned east again, eyeing the far horizon where India scented the trade winds with cinnamon and pepper. Scouting parties mapped the Indus Valley. Persian scribes noted cotton fields and clever riverboats with stitched hulls. Lapis lazuli, ivory, and ideas flowed back to Persepolis, where the half-built terraces erupted into columns carved with twin-horned bulls. Stonecutters from Lydia chiseled reliefs of delegations bearing gifts, Assyrians with rams, Ethiopians with ivory tusks, Indians with jars of gold dust, each figure rendered in respectful procession beneath the gaze of the monarch. In private moments, Darius walked these halls barefoot, feeling the cool stone draw heat from his pulse. He thought of Cyrus, the shepherd king, of Cambyses, spirited and sad, of himself, the lawgiver balancing empire on a stylus tip. He wondered if mankind could stretch any farther without snapping like an overdrawn bow. Then dawn's trumpet would echo, and another petition would wait, another province to survey, another bridge of reeds to lay across a river of history. Behind palace screens, artisans beat molten glass into tiles the color of Persian twilight. They inscribed the king's creed in cuneiform. By the grace of Ahura Mazda, I am king. By my law, the strong shall not oppress the weak. Noble words, though in Zagros valleys peasants still toiled from sunrise to starfall, and in Babylonian alleys gamblers still wagered sons against debt. Yet the words mattered. They were the mortar-binding peoples who spoke 100 tongues into one architecture of aspiration. Far north, Scythian riders watched Persian surveyors marking step paths with cedar stakes. They saw in those stakes the first fangs of empire, and melted into the grass seas, arrows tipped with venom, ready to remind settled men that wind respects no boundary. Darius pursued them for months, his supply line stretching thin as spider silk, until he learned the lesson every conqueror must. Some horizons remain mirage. He returned to Susa older, edges sand-worn, but his vision intact. He commissioned canals across Thrace, mint houses along the Oxus, and the hall of 100 columns in Persepolis, a forest of stone where future kings would hold Nowruz audiences under petal-shaped capitals. Years rolled like desert fog. The Nile swelled and shrank. The Indus glittered. The Aegean churned with rumors of another Greek campaign. And somewhere among account tablets and courier pouches, the memory of Cyrus still guided Darius's hand. A policy of tolerance here, a merciful pardon there, echoes of the shepherd king whispering that empire lasts only as long as it can convince its subjects that they too own a piece of its vastness. One spring, Darius stood upon the terrace at Persepolis watching delegations arrive for the New Year festival. Nubians with leopard skins, Cappadocians leading fine horses, Phoenicians bearing dyed cloth glowing like pomegranates. All faces different, all footsteps converging toward the same throne. For a moment, the grand design of empire shimmered clear, not domination, but orchestration, a symphony of tribes whose instruments might otherwise clash in cacophony. Then the sun slid behind Zagros peaks, painting the columns blood orange. Courtiers lit torches. Somewhere a servant began whispering in Darius's ear, fulfilling old habit. Remember the Athenians. The king's jaw tightened. The score of empire shifted, gathering martial drums beneath its soaring strings. War would come again, as sure as equinox follows solstice. Yet in that twilight pause, one could almost believe the ideal. An empire vast enough to house difference, just enough to honor roots, firm enough to ward chaos. Torchlight flickered on reliefs of lotus blooms and winged bulls. Darius turned away, sandal steps echoing down polished corridors. Beyond the palace walls, night winds carried the mingled scents of myrrh, camel sweat, and distant almond groves. Farther still, in a tomb guarded by silence and stars, Cyrus slept on in limestone calm, unaware that his dream still breathed. ragged, brilliant, and unrelenting in the restless hearts of his heirs. The empire Cyrus had founded was a living organism, not a statue of conquest, but a heartbeat pulsing through every distant province. Decades after his death, his laws still guided scribes in Babylon, his roads still carried wine jars stamped with his seal, and his tomb still drew generals who left behind flowers, coins, and whispered promises. But his vision had evolved to through the hands of those who followed him. Cambyses with his short, fiery reign, Darius with his mastery of organization, and now a boy whose destiny stirred in the eastern hills, Xerxes, son of Darius. In the cool dawn air of Susa, Xerxes stood barefoot in the temple of Ahura Mazda, his hands dusted with ritual ash, chanting prayers older than the throne he had just inherited. His voice was deep, uncertain, still raw with the grief of his father's passing. He had watched Darius weaken through his final weeks, first skipping war councils, then meals, then even the No-Ruse procession. The old king had stared out across Persepolis one last time and said, "Do not forget Cyrus." He was not merely a conqueror, he was a gardener. Water the roots and the tree will survive the storm. Xerxes took the throne not amid cheers but under clouds. The Greek states across the Aegean still defied Persian rule. They had sent spears and silver to rebels in Ionia. Darius had planned to invade again, to avenge the insult of Marathon, but death took him before he could see it through. Now that burden passed to Xerxes, along with the crown, the empire, and the expectation to be both fire and light. Counselors urged caution, satraps fidgeted in court robes, but Xerxes at first hesitated. Unlike his father, he did not rush into campaigns. For a year he reviewed tax ledgers, rebuilt fortresses in Armenia, and dispatched emissaries bearing tokens of goodwill to Greece. Some were thrown into wells or beheaded. So be it. Diplomacy had been offered. The gods, he decided, would now smile only upon strength. Preparations for war began on a scale Persia had never seen. The royal road buzzed with movement, bronze-armored Medes, Assyrian slingers, Egyptian archers, Ionian shipwrights, building triremes in Phoenician harbors. Across the empire, food was stored, weapons forged, and thousands conscripted. On the shores of the Hellespont, engineers linked Asia to Europe with pontoon bridges stretching across the sea itself. When storms destroyed the first attempt, Xerxes ordered the waves flogged and shackled. Symbolic, yes, but a declaration that even nature must yield to Persian resolve. 2 years into his reign, Xerxes stood at the head of the greatest army the world had yet known. Some claimed over 2 million, though more sober accounts guess a quarter of that. They drank from silver cups, wore embroidered tunics, and carried the pride of every province between the Indus and the Nile. He marched them through Thrace, then into the mountains of northern Greece. At Thermopylae, they met their first resistance. The Spartans, led by King Leonidas, stood in a narrow pass no wider than a chariot. Though vastly outnumbered, they fought with grim defiance, slowing the Persian advance for days. The battle entered legend not for its scale, but for its symbolism. That liberty, however outnumbered, could draw blood from empire. Still, Xerxes pressed on. He reached Athens, found it abandoned, and burned it. Yet the Greeks did not break. At Salamis, their fleet struck a blow in narrow straits, where Persian numbers became a hindrance. Triremes splintered, oars snapped. By nightfall, smoke curled over the Aegean like the memory of vengeance unmet. Xerxes withdrew, not defeated but bleeding. The war would drag on for years under his generals, but never again would Persia command the certainty of its divine right to rule the West. It was the beginning of a shift, a reminder that even Cyrus's dream had limits. Still, the heart of the empire remained strong. Far from the flames of Athens, life in Persia continued with the rhythm Cyrus had designed. In Bactria, traders still bartered lapis for wool. In Sardis, the coin minter still poured gold into fire-hardened molds. Satraps judged disputes using the legal tablets Cyrus had standardized. His model of rule, autonomy under central wisdom, continued to anchor the empire even as its edges strained. In the years that followed, Persian architecture reached new heights. Xerxes continued Darius's projects in Persepolis, completing the massive Gate of All Nations and the throne hall, with columns so tall they seemed to touch the sun. Sculptors carved new friezes of tribute bearers, Saka and fox fur caps, Armenians with horses, Ethiopians carrying tusks, each stepping forward in eternal procession. These weren't just decorations, they were statements. That unity was possible, that difference could be harmonized. Cyrus had started that project when he chose to allow Jews to return to Jerusalem, to rebuild their temple, to keep their faith. It wasn't sentiment, it was strategy. Loyalty, he knew, grew faster in soil tilled with respect. Xerxes, too, issued edicts in multiple languages, consulted local priests before governing distant lands, and preserved many local customs. Yet there were cracks in the marble. In Babylon, resentment festered. The great city that once welcomed Cyrus now simmered with discontent over taxation, over being ruled from afar. Twice during Xerxes' reign, Babylon rebelled. Xerxes crushed them both times, stripping the city of its sacred status, melting down idols and removing its golden statue of Marduk, the one Cyrus had honored decades earlier. It was a shift. Where Cyrus had knelt, Xerxes now broke. The bond between king and subject grew brittle. Even so, the Persian court flourished. Banquets shimmered with saffron dishes, fig wines, and dancers from every province. Scholars debated ethics under torchlight, and scribes recorded the king's deeds in 3 scripts. Yet beneath the perfume and poetry, the burden of maintaining such a vast empire pressed heavier each year. By the time Xerxes died, assassinated by his own court officials in a tangle of palace intrigue, Persia stood at a crossroads. His son, Artaxerxes I, would inherit a throne not of iron or flame, but of sand and silk, firm only as long as the winds of rebellion stayed still. The outer provinces, particularly in Egypt and Asia Minor, would test the empire's hold again and again, and through it all, people remembered Cyrus. Even among his successors' failures, even as greed or arrogance slipped into governance, the memory of the founder lingered like incense after a prayer. He had conquered, yes, but he had also freed. He had ruled, yes, but through respect, not domination. In every temple that remained standing because he allowed it, in every people who spoke their language without fear, in every road that brought ideas as much as goods, his influence remained. From the outer fortresses of Lydia to the eastern borders along the Oxus, travelers still paused at his tomb near Pasargadae. There, beneath the layered stones and simple gabled roof, a faded inscription once read, "O man, whoever you are and wherever you come from, for I know you will come. I am Cyrus, who founded the empire of the Persians. Do not begrudge me this bit of earth that covers my body." Alexander of Macedon would one day stand before that tomb in silence, ordering its repair after centuries of neglect. Conquerors came and went, empires rose and fell. But Cyrus the Great remained, not just in stone or scroll, but in the bones of an idea. That rule could be just, that empire could uplift, and that memory, like empire, endures best when built not on fear, but on trust. And so the third act of the great founder's story closes, not in battle, nor in palace intrigue, but in the slow unfolding of legacy. The ripples of Cyrus's choices still shape the world generations later, and in some ways, they still do. His was a life that planted the idea of empire not as tyranny, but as stewardship, not as erasure, but as inclusion, and that perhaps was his boldest conquest of all. Centuries passed, the Achaemenid dynasty fell, toppled by Alexander of Macedon, who wept not because Cyrus's empire was gone, but because he had no more worlds to conquer. Alexander, in a moment of startling humility, stood before Cyrus's tomb and paid tribute. He ordered it repaired, guarded. Some say he even copied Cyrus's model of rule, marrying Persian women, wearing Persian robes, keeping Persian advisors. But Alexander's was a fire that burned fast and bright. His empire shattered almost as soon as he was gone. What Cyrus had built, by contrast, endured, not in marble, but in memory. His name faded from official inscriptions as the Seleucids took control, and later the Parthians and Sassanids. Yet among the people, the memory of Cyrus never died. In Persian folklore, he became more than a man, a just king, a bringer of order, a symbol of wisdom. Even as Zoroastrianism evolved, many saw in Cyrus a chosen agent of Ahura Mazda, a righteous king who brought light to a darkened world. Centuries later in the Torah, he appears not as a pagan conqueror, but as a liberator. The book of Isaiah refers to him as the Anointed One, a term normally reserved for Israelite kings or priests. This wasn't just politics, it was theology. For the Jews exiled in Babylon, Cyrus had done what no prophet, no priest, no warrior could. He had restored their homeland and rebuilt their temple. In a world torn by empires, this gesture, so rare, so unexpected, burned into cultural memory. Christian scribes later inherited these stories, seeing in Cyrus a foreshadowing of divine kingship. In the Quran, although Cyrus is not named directly, many scholars believe he is the figure known as Dhul-Qarnayn, the two-horned one, a righteous ruler who travels to the ends of the earth, builds a wall to protect humanity, and governs with justice and mercy. Whether or not this was truly Cyrus, the connection tells us something deeper. Across traditions, across continents, he was remembered as a moral ruler, a figure of cosmic balance, and that perhaps is the most astonishing part of his legacy. In a world where conquerors are usually remembered for terror, Cyrus was remembered for restraint. While many kings built monuments to their own glory, Cyrus's greatness was carved into the lives he didn't destroy, the gods he didn't suppress, the peoples he didn't erase. Even his capital, Pasargadae, reflected this humility. It wasn't a city of grandeur like Persepolis or Babylon, but a low, open complex of gardens, pavilions, and modest stone buildings. Its purpose was not to awe, but to breathe. The very word paradise comes from the old Persian paradisa, meaning walled garden, a place of peace, of cultivated beauty. This is what Cyrus left behind, not merely cities or conquests, but a feeling. That feeling would echo again far beyond Persia. In the 18th century, as Europe and the Americas reeled from revolutions, Enlightenment thinkers rediscovered Cyrus. Thomas Jefferson owned multiple copies of Xenophon's Cyropedia, a partly fictionalized account of Cyrus's life that portrayed him as the ideal ruler, brave, wise, merciful. Jefferson read it not for its historical precision, but for its political philosophy. In an age seeking to define liberty and leadership, Cyrus was resurrected as a model of the enlightened ruler. Some scholars even argue that Jefferson's ideas about religious tolerance and the rights of minorities, so central to the American experiment, were influenced by this image of Cyrus. Whether or not that connection is direct, the resonance is unmistakable. Cyrus had become, once again, more than a man. He was a mirror, reflecting back what each generation sought to believe about power and justice, and still, his tomb stood. Though looted by Macedonians, shaken by earthquakes, and eroded by centuries of wind, the simple structure in Pasargadae remained. Locals called it Madrasa Soleiman, the School of Solomon, believing it to be the tomb of a prophet. In the 20th century, archaeologists finally confirmed its identity. Beneath 6 stone steps, in a small chamber under a pitched limestone roof, lay the resting place of Cyrus the Great. Iran, now reborn as a modern nation, embraced him anew. During the reign of Reza Shah in the 1930s, Cyrus was elevated as a national hero, proof that Persian greatness had ancient roots. School books taught his story. Coins bore his image. Even the Iranian monarchy claimed direct descent. In 1971, the 2,500th anniversary of the founding of the Persian Empire was celebrated with an opulent ceremony at Persepolis, where dignitaries from around the world gathered to honor Cyrus. Yet history, as always, is not a straight line. Just 8 years later, the Iranian Revolution swept aside the monarchy. The new Islamic Republic, wary of ancient kings and secular nationalism, downplayed Cyrus's legacy. Yet the people remembered. In recent decades, as Iranians searched for a unifying identity, beyond politics, beyond religion, Cyrus re-emerged not as a ruler to be worshipped, but as a symbol of values, dignity, freedom, tolerance. Each year on October 29th, known unofficially as Cyrus the Great Day, thousands gather at his tomb, laying flowers, reciting poetry, some even chanting, "Cyrus is our father, Iran is our country." It's not state-sponsored, it's not compulsory, it's memory made sacred by choice. The tomb itself remains humble, no gold, no marble lions, just weathered stone and the sky above it, a place where a man, once the most powerful in the world, rests alone, surrounded by the silence of the land he once unified. There's something fitting in that. He came from a modest tribe in Anshan. He died not in palace intrigue, but in battle, defending his eastern frontier. and he left behind not opulence, but order. That's the paradox of Cyrus. He conquered more territory than almost anyone before him, yet is remembered not for the blood he spilled, but for the peace he made. He founded an empire, yet permitted its subjects to worship, speak, and live freely. He wielded absolute power, but is celebrated for the times he chose not to use it. In a world still wrestling with the meaning of leadership, where power often corrupts, where tolerance can seem fragile, Cyrus's story remains startlingly relevant. His empire is long gone, but the questions he answered with his life endure. Can you rule without fear? Can you expand without erasure? Can you build something that outlives your own ambition? The ruins of Pasargadae do not shout, they whisper. They don't demand awe. They ask for reflection. And in that quiet, we hear the echo of a life that changed the course of human civilization, not through cruelty or terror, but through vision, respect, and restraint. So when we look at Cyrus today across millennia through texts both sacred and secular, we are not just studying a king, we are remembering a possibility, that empire does not have to mean oppression, that conquest does not have to destroy, and that greatness, real greatness, is often measured not by what you take, but by what you choose to give. Cyrus the Great did not live forever, but the idea of him did, and perhaps that's the most powerful legacy of all. They say the sea remembers everything, every creaking hull, every oar dipped in fury or fear, every scream swallowed by the waves. In the ancient world, war was not just fought on fields and walls, it bled into the oceans. From the gilded triremes of the Greeks to the fire-spitting vessels of the Byzantines, naval warfare was a terrifying, smoke-choked ballet of splinters, screams, and salt. In the earliest days, seafaring was about fish, trade, and escape. But very quickly, humans realized the sea could also be a weapon, and like everything else in the ancient world, it wasn't subtle. No long-distance missiles, no sonar or radar, just rowers, rams, ropes, and desperation. Imagine the years 1200 BCE. You're aboard a Mycenaean galley. It's long and narrow, carved from a single pine trunk, maybe two lashed together. Your job isn't glamorous. You're one of 40 men with a paddle in your hand and a tight grip on your breakfast. The sea's not calm. It rarely is. You're not here to sail into battle. You're here to row into it. Sweat, grunt, strain, then crash into your enemy with enough force to rip open his hull and maybe your own. Naval combat in the ancient world wasn't a side note. It was often the deciding force in empires. Control the sea, control the trade routes, control the trade routes, control the economy. And that's how you get an empire. Let's fast forward a bit to one of the first truly organized naval forces, the Egyptians. Now, the Nile wasn't an ocean, but it was everything to them. Lifeline, highway, and warpath. The Egyptians weren't known for open sea combat, but their river fleets were formidable. Their boats were mostly made from bundled papyrus reeds at first, then eventually cedarwood imported from Lebanon. These ships were light, fast, and maneuverable. They were crewed by archers, shield bearers, and polemen, soldiers trained to fight at a distance and up close if needed. But they weren't alone. The sea peoples, mysterious invaders from the north and west, brought something new: chaos. Around 1177 BCE, these groups, likely a coalition of raiders from the Aegean and possibly southern Europe, descended upon Egypt, the Levant, and Anatolia. Rameses III fought them off barely, with a mix of land troops and a decisive naval battle in the Nile Delta. Egyptian artwork from the time shows their navy arrayed in tight formation, meeting the enemy head-on as archers from shore rained down arrows. The sea turned red, the story says. That's how most ancient naval battles ended. If the waves didn't take you, the blade did. Now we travel west, across the Aegean, to the birthplace of the classic naval warship, Greece. Ancient Greece wasn't a unified nation. It was a scatterplot of rival city-states like Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and Rhodes. And these cities didn't just trade and argue, they went to war. Often, and if you were Athens, the sea was your best defense and your biggest ambition. By the 5th century BCE, Athens had developed one of the most feared naval forces in history. Their weapon of choice? The trireme, a sleek, deadly warship powered by 170 oarsmen arranged in 3 staggered levels. If you think rowing sounds hard, imagine doing it shoulder to shoulder, blind, synchronized, and for hours. Some oarsmen trained for years to perfect their rhythm. These weren't slaves, at least not all of them. They were often free citizens, sometimes even volunteers who took pride in their role. The trireme wasn't designed for comfort. It was a weapon with a bronze ram on the front, a long spear of metal meant to punch through enemy hulls. The tactic was simple. Row fast, angle carefully, ram hard, and retreat before you got stuck. Then repeat. If you missed, well, then it turned into a floating street fight, with boarding, stabbing, screaming, and maybe setting fire to something. The Battle of Salamis in 480 BCE is often hailed as the moment Greek naval power peaked. After years of war, Xerxes of Persia had pushed into Greek territory with one of the largest armies the ancient world had ever seen. But at Salamis, the Greeks, led by Athenian general Themistocles, used tight channels, superior knowledge of local waters, and coordinated triremes to outmaneuver the Persians. The Persians had more ships, but size wasn't everything. The Greek ships darted between them, ramming, boarding, and setting fires. When it was over, Persian dominance at sea was broken, and this is a recurring theme in ancient naval combat. Big fleets often lost to smarter, more agile ones. In many ways, ancient sea battles were chess matches played in waves. Geography mattered, timing mattered, even the direction of the wind could tip the balance. But what happened when things went wrong? You didn't want to fall into the water. Ancient sailors weren't usually swimmers. There were no life jackets. Ships didn't carry enough rafts or ropes for everyone. Falling overboard during battle meant you probably drowned, unless someone decided to spear you first. Let's talk equipment. Most naval fighters weren't armored the way land soldiers were. Too much metal meant you'd sink like a stone. But they did carry weapons, short swords, javelins, bows, and slings. Some ships had catapults on deck that could hurl flaming projectiles or heavy stones. But honestly, it was close combat that dominated. The goal was to disable the enemy ship, either by ramming, burning, or boarding it. And then there was fire. Fire at sea is a sailor's nightmare, and some ancient navies used it on purpose. Greeks and later Byzantines experimented with incendiary weapons. They didn't have napalm, but they had a primitive version of it. Mixtures of sulfur, resin, oil, and saltpeter. These were thrown in pots or launched from tubes and could cling to surfaces while burning. More on that later. Returning to the Greeks, naval warfare became an extension of their politics. Athens, with its mighty fleet, controlled the Delian League, a coalition of allied city-states that paid tribute in return for protection. But protection turned to domination, and eventually even fellow Greeks got tired of Athenian arrogance. That tension exploded during the Peloponnesian War, when Athens and Sparta clashed in a decades-long conflict that drained both sides. Naval battles during that war were frequent and devastating. Fleets clashed around the Aegean, using surprise attacks, blockades, and ambushes. In one battle, the Athenian fleet at Syracuse was completely wiped out. Thousands of men were lost, ships destroyed, and morale shattered. The sea, once Athens' strength, became its grave. And if you're wondering, no, it wasn't always glorious. Ancient naval warfare was exhausting, terrifying, and confusing. Visibility was low. Orders were shouted over crashing waves and screams. Injury meant death. There were no field hospitals floating nearby. Blood in the water attracted sharks in some regions. Hunger, rot, and mutiny weren't uncommon during longer campaigns. Still, men fought at sea again and again. Why? Because control of the sea meant survival. It meant wealth. It meant glory. Let's pause here, but we're just getting started. We haven't even reached the Romans yet. In the next part, we'll climb aboard the warships of Carthage, march with the Roman Marines, and see how one small innovation turned the tide of a legendary war. As we drift from the Aegean into the western Mediterranean, we sail directly into the shadow of two rising powers, Rome and Carthage. What began as trade competition turned into centuries of bitter rivalry, and while land battles like Cannae and Zama often get the spotlight, it was naval supremacy that truly shaped the destiny of these empires. Carthage, perched on the North African coast, was a maritime giant. By the 3rd century BCE, its fleet dominated the seas. Their ships were fast, heavily armed, and manned by skilled sailors from all across their territory, from Iberia to Libya to the Phoenician homelands. Carthage's power lay in its mastery of commerce in the sea. Rome, however, was still a land-based power. more familiar with marching legions than managing rigging. But in 264 BCE, everything changed. The First Punic War broke out over control of Sicily, and with it, Rome realized something crucial. If they wanted to survive, they had to learn to fight at sea. Problem was, they had no navy. So the Romans did what they always did best. They copied and improved. According to legend, a Carthaginian warship ran aground on an Italian beach. The Romans studied it, plank by plank, then built an entire fleet modeled after it. But they knew they couldn't match Carthaginian seamanship overnight. So instead of relying on maneuvering and ramming, the Romans invented something different, something simple, something brutal. It was called the corvus, Latin for crow. Picture a long boarding plank mounted on the deck of a Roman ship. It had a spike at the bottom and could be dropped like a trapdoor onto the deck of an enemy vessel. Once the spike embedded into the wood, Roman marines would rush across, turning a sea battle into a land skirmish, their specialty. The tactic worked shockingly well. At the Battle of Mylae in 260 BCE, the Romans used the corvus to capture or destroy 50 Carthaginian ships. Suddenly, Rome wasn't just a land power anymore, but it came at a cost. The corvus was heavy. It made the ships unstable in rough waters. Entire fleets sank in storms, not from enemy fire, but from the weight of their own innovation. Even so, the Romans kept building, kept fighting, and eventually, they won. Carthage, once queen of the Mediterranean, lost its naval dominance. The First Punic War ended with Rome in control of Sicily and the sea between them. The Second Punic War brought Hannibal and his famous march over the Alps. But while the elephants get the headlines, the naval campaigns were just as important. Rome blockaded ports, cut off Carthaginian supply lines, and used its fleet to strike deep into enemy territory. By the time of the Third Punic War, Carthage was a shadow of its former self. In 146 BCE, Rome destroyed the city. The harbor was filled with rubble. The sea, once their power, became their tomb. With Carthage gone, Rome ruled the Mediterranean, the Mare Nostrum, as they called it, our sea. But keeping a sea empire meant constant patrolling, fighting pirates, and transporting troops. Roman naval organization was brutally efficient. They had fleets stationed across the empire, at Ravenna in Italy, Alexandria in Egypt, and Misenum near Naples. The ships varied: Liburnians, triremes, quadriremes, even massive hexaremes in some cases. These weren't always fast, but they were stable, practical, and deadly in formation. A Roman warship typically carried a mix of sailors, oarsmen, and marines. The sailors handled the rigging. The oarsmen, often slaves or lower-class citizens, powered the ship, and the marines did the killing. They wore lighter armor than legionaries, often fought with short swords and javelins, and were trained in close-quarters combat. Naval battles in Roman times were almost always decided by boarding actions. Fire was used, but sparingly. No one wanted their own ship to go up in flames. The Roman navy also excelled at logistics. They moved entire legions across the sea in days. They supplied remote provinces. They hunted pirates, especially in the eastern Mediterranean. Pirates had become a plague by the 1st century BCE, raiding coastal towns and even kidnapping Roman nobles. In response, the Senate gave Pompey Magnus extraordinary powers in 67 BCE to deal with the problem. Pompey took the task seriously. Within 3 months, he cleared the seas of piracy. It wasn't magic, it was method. He divided the sea into zones, assigned commanders to each, and struck quickly and decisively. The result? Trade resumed. The grain supply flowed, and Pompey's legend grew. Of course, not everything went smoothly. Naval disasters still happened. Storms sank fleets. In 255 BCE, during the First Punic War, over 250 Roman ships were lost in a single tempest. Tens of thousands of men drowned. These were not isolated incidents. The sea was a harsh, unforgiving battlefield, and it wasn't just about ships. Coastal fortresses, signal towers, lighthouses, and naval arsenals played vital roles. The famous lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, wasn't just a marvel of architecture. It was a navigational tool, a symbol of power, and a watchtower. Nearby, the Roman navy had its base in Egypt, controlling the Nile Delta in the eastern Mediterranean with brutal precision. Now, let's shift to tactics. In Roman naval warfare, Coordination was everything. Ships moved in tight formations, lines, wedges, columns, depending on the objective. A frontal assault might use a dig-plouse maneuver, piercing the enemy line and circling back for ramming runs. A defensive stance might form a crescent shape to envelop attackers. Orders were communicated through flags, trumpets, and torch signals, but confusion was common. Amid smoke, wind, and screaming men, command often broke down. Boarding was chaotic. Grappling hooks were thrown, planks were lowered, arrows rained, firepots were hurled. Then came the clash of metal, screams, slipping on blood-soaked decks. It was over in minutes, or dragged on for hours. When a ship was taken, its crew might be enslaved, ransomed, or simply thrown overboard. And then there was morale. Rowing for hours, exposed to sun, salt, and fear, broke many men. Some rowers were chained to benches. Others rowed voluntarily for pay or the promise of citizenship. On some voyages, half the crew would die, not from combat, but from dysentery, hunger, or heat stroke. Yet still they sailed. After all, Rome was an empire of engineers. Their warships were constantly updated. They learned to adapt to different waters, rough Atlantic coastlines, narrow rivers, calm harbors, and their enemies noticed. Across the eastern Mediterranean, a new naval power was emerging, the Byzantine Empire. Technically Roman, but transformed. Greek-speaking, Orthodox Christian, and obsessed with defending the Bosporus Strait, their lifeline between Europe and Asia. And the Byzantines brought something terrifying to naval warfare: liquid fire. Sometimes called Greek fire, this secret weapon changed everything. It was a flammable substance launched from siphons, tubes, or clay pots. It could stick to ships, armor, even water, and it kept burning. Picture a quiet harbor. Then suddenly, a jet of flame arcs through the air, slamming into a ship's deck. Sailors scream. Wood ignites. Buckets of water do nothing. That was Greek fire. And it was one of the most closely guarded military secrets of the medieval world. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. By the 2nd century CE, Rome was at its height, but the empire was stretched thin. Enemies on every frontier, rebellions, economic strain. The navy remained crucial, but like much of Rome, it began to decline. Fewer resources, less training, corruption. The Western Empire eventually fell, but in the east the Byzantines carried the naval torch. We'll return to them in our next part, but first, take a moment to imagine. You're standing on the deck of a Roman warship. The wind pulls at the sails. The drum beats a slow rhythm for the oars. Somewhere in the mist ahead, enemy ships await. You check your gear, short sword, helmet, a javelin in hand, and you wait. You wait for the order that will launch you into a brutal, beautiful, blood-stained dance atop the waves. The Roman Empire may have split, crumbled, and burned, but the sea never lost its hunger. In the east, a new power rose from the ruins, the Byzantine Empire. In name, they were Romans. In speech, Greek. And on the sea, they became legends. The capital, Constantinople, guarded by the Bosporus Strait, was a city born for naval war. Whoever controlled the narrow waters there could control trade, invasions, survival. The Byzantine navy was not the largest in the ancient world, but it was the most feared, and for one terrible reason, they wielded a weapon that didn't behave like anything seen before. It was called Greek fire. You've heard of it, but imagine seeing it. You're on a calm sea. Enemy ships begin to circle. There's a loud hiss, like steam bursting from a cauldron. Then a flaming jet erupts from the mouth of a bronze tube. Fire arcs through the sky, trailing smoke. It lands with a monstrous splash and keeps burning. It clings to sails, skin, armor. Screams rise. The sea glows orange. Water offers no escape. That was the Byzantine advantage. Greek fire couldn't be extinguished easily, and the formula was a closely guarded secret, likely involving a mix of oil, pine resin, and sulfur. It worked like ancient napalm. Some said it was a gift from God, others called it devil's breath. But the Byzantines didn't rely only on Greek fire. Their naval strategy was deeply tactical. They understood the sea like an old companion. They built dromons, sleek, fast warships with lateen sails and multiple decks of oarsmen. Some were equipped with catapults and fire siphons. Others relied on the boarding tactics of old. The crews were diverse: Greek sailors, Slavic rowers, Armenian marines. Discipline was brutal but effective. Their ships patrolled not only the Bosporus, but the Aegean, the Adriatic, and the Levant. The navy kept trade routes open, suppressed rebellions, and repelled Arab invasions. And the greatest test came in the 7th and 8th centuries CE, when the Arab Caliphate surged outward from the Arabian Peninsula. The Arabs were not traditionally a naval people, but they learned fast. As the Rashidun and then Umayyad Caliphates expanded, they realized that to strike Byzantium, they had to master the sea. They built their first fleets in Alexandria and Tyre. Within a generation, they had developed formidable naval forces. Muslim fleets clashed with Byzantines in the eastern Mediterranean, blockading Constantinople twice. Both times, Greek fire saved the city, but Arab navies continued to evolve. They were agile, resourceful, and inspired by the Prophet's early directives to carry Islam across seas as well as sands. Battles like the one at the Gulf of Phoenix in 655 CE proved their strength, and while the Byzantines often held the line, the Arabs changed the balance of power in the Eastern Sea. Coastal cities were raided, trade routes disrupted. The Mediterranean was no longer a Roman lake. Still, Constantinople stood, its harbor, the Golden Horn, protected by a massive chain drawn across the water and guarded by fire-spewing ships. For centuries, this city stood as an immovable rock against the rising tide. But while the east burned, a different storm brewed in the north. Cold, wind-swept, and cloaked in mist, Scandinavia was no one's idea of a naval powerhouse, until the Vikings came. Between the 8th and 11th centuries, Norse longships became the terror of every coastal village from Ireland to Byzantium. The genius of the Viking ship was in its simplicity and speed. Long, narrow, and shallow-drafted, these vessels could sail across oceans and slip up rivers alike. They could be rowed or sailed. They could be carried over land, and they came without warning. Viking raids were often surgical and brutal. A monastery might fall in minutes. A coastal town burned before it even knew it was under attack. Longships weren't just for raids, though. They carried settlers, traders, and warriors. Viking naval power wasn't just terror, it was mobility. By the late 9th century, these Norse fleets had become massive. The great heathen army that invaded Anglo-Saxon England brought hundreds of ships and thousands of warriors. And while Viking naval tactics weren't built around formal sea battles like the Greeks or Romans, they were devastating in their own way. Hit fast, disappear faster. Sometimes, though, the Vikings met other navies head-on. The Battle of Hafrsfjord in Norway, around 872 CE, is remembered as the unification of the kingdom under Harald Fairhair. Longships clashed, grappling hooks were thrown. Men fought hand-to-hand on decks slick with seawater and blood. The Byzantine Empire, interestingly, didn't fight the Vikings. They hired them. By the 10th century, Norse mercenaries had become elite guards for the emperor in Constantinople, the Varangian Guard. These hardened sailors and fighters brought not just strength, but naval knowledge. The Byzantines, in turn, offered them gold, status, and opportunity. Meanwhile, in the western Mediterranean, a new force began to rise. The Italian maritime republics, Venice, Genoa, and Pisa all realized what earlier empires had learned. The sea was power. These city-states weren't large in territory, but their fleets reached across Europe. Merchant ships escorted by war galleys became common. Piracy returned, too, not just from the Muslim corsairs of North Africa, but Christian pirates seeking fortune under false flags. Naval battles became more complex. Ships grew larger, sturdier. They had raised decks for archers. Some carried small trebuchets or ballistae. Naval architecture was evolving, but so were alliances and betrayals. Venice might fight Genoa one year, then ally with them the next against a Muslim fleet or Byzantine rival. The Battle of Meloria in 1284 between Genoa and Pisa saw fleets of over 90 galleys collide in brutal formation. Hundreds of men were killed or captured. It was one of the largest naval battles of the medieval era, and it wasn't even about empire. It was about trade, money, pride. But amid all this evolution, some old truths remained. Ships still relied on wind or muscle. Rowers still groaned under the weight of endless movement. Fires still consumed fleets when battles went wrong, and the sea, patient as ever, swallowed it all. Throughout this era, weather remained the ultimate wild card. Storms could end campaigns before a single weapon was drawn. Winds could trap fleets in enemy waters. Misjudged tides led to strandings and deaths. Superstition ran high. Sailors feared sea monsters, cursed waters, and omens. Some ships carried carved figures at the prow, protective spirits in wood. Others bore sails painted with eyes or religious symbols. The sounds of ancient naval life never changed much. The slap of water against hulls, the creak of timber, the rhythmic beat of a drum for rowers, the bark of oars, the shriek of gulls overhead, and sometimes, when everything went wrong, the screams. Yet the rewards were enormous. Naval dominance meant more than victory. It meant colonies, it meant gold, it meant survival. The sea was the bloodstream of ancient empires, and the people aboard, often anonymous. Most sailors didn't leave names behind. Their bones lie at the bottom of forgotten bays, their stories erased by salt and time. But without them, no empire would have stood. As we prepare to close this part of our voyage, consider how much history was written not by kings or generals, but by tired men pulling oars, by shipbuilders in coastal villages, by cooks and navigators and rowers who never saw the inside of a palace, but carried it across oceans. Night settles thick over the water, and the last oar beats we heard in Part 3 have faded into the hush. Yet the story of naval warfare does not end with Greek fire hissing across Byzantine decks, or longships ghosting along northern coasts. Ships kept changing. Planks, sails, weapons, and the very wind in their rigging evolved, until the sea became less a barrier and more a road between worlds. Tonight, we sail through that hinge in history, when rowing benches gave way to towering masts, when bronze-tipped rams surrendered to iron shot, and when the oceans opened the way to an age that owed its ferocity and its possibilities to the long experiments of ancient seafarers. At first glance, the shift seems simple. Swap muscle for wind. In practice, it took centuries. Even as late as the 13th century, war galleys on the Mediterranean still looked eerily like Roman vessels. Long, narrow, propelled by banks of oars and crewed by men who sweated for every nautical mile. But change whispered in canvas. On Arab dhows and Byzantine commerce craft, the lateen sail, a triangular sheet suspended from a long yard, set at an angle to the mast, proved it could push a vessel closer to the wind than square sails ever had. Suddenly, captains didn't have to wait for the right breeze. They could tack against it, zigzagging up channels that once trapped them. What began as a merchant's advantage became a war captain's dream. European shipwrights studied those Arab rigs. In the bustling yards of Amalfi, Barcelona, and Valencia, they spliced lateen agility onto sturdy hulls borrowed from Norse and Frankish designs. The result was the hybrid galley Saida, still rowed when urgency called, but now able to sprint beneath sail. On windy days, oarsmen could rest and sharpen blades. On placid waters, they could hurl the vessel forward for a ramming strike. It was the first hint that muscle power alone might be retired, yet oars weren't so easily dismissed. In the cramped confines of the Aegean archipelagos or the lagoons of Venice, maneuvering under sail remained risky, so navies hedged their bets. The Venetian Galea Sotto bristled with both slender masts and dozens of oars, its hull reinforced to carry small ballistae and increasingly the newest terror, gunpowder. Gunpowder crept onto European warships in the 14th century like distant thunder. The Chinese had experimented with ship-mounted rockets and grenades centuries earlier. Now the formula crossed deserts and seas carried by merchants and Mongol armies, until European alchemists packed the smoky grains into iron tubes. Early ship guns were crude, prone to bursting, but even a single thunderclap could shatter an opponent's morale. On the River Po in 1379, Venetian and Genoese galleys traded pot-de-fer volleys that echoed across vineyards, the future announcing itself in sulfur and flame. Still, the real revolution needed a new hull. Rowing galleys could not bear many heavy cannon without sagging or capsizing. Enter the carrack, born in Portuguese yards along the Tagus. Broad-waisted, round-bowed, and built from stout oak, the carrack rose high above the waterline, with forecastle and sterncastle bristling like stone towers at sea. Instead of a single row of oar ports, it carried multiple decks and, crucially, batteries of wrought iron cannon arranged along its flanks. Sail, not oar, was its engine. Vast square courses drove it before Atlantic winds, while a lateen mizzen offered steering finesse. Within a generation, Portuguese sailors rowed these floating fortresses down the African coast, their guns roaring greetings at any harbor that hesitated to trade. Soon Spain matched them with towering naus, and later streamlined galleons whose sleek tumble-home sides deflected enemy fire while concentrating their own broadsides. Yet none of this would have been possible without the mathematics of balance first honed on Greek triremes. Beam-to-length ratios, keel curvature, and the placement of ballast had been argued in dusty Mediterranean shipyards for 2 millennia. The galleon's majestic silhouette was, at heart, an ancient equation carried to a new solution. As sails multiplied, rowers faded from war decks, except in the Mediterranean, where the galley tradition refused to die. The Ottoman Empire fielded massive galley fleets into the 16th century, crewed by chained prisoners and paid volunteers alike. Their speed in calm seas remained unmatched. At the Battle of Preveza in 1538, Ottoman Admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa used nimble galleys to surround and rout a lumbering Holy League fleet before the Christian guns could bring their broadsides to bear. It was a harsh lesson. Technology alone never guaranteed victory. Skill and geography and timing still ruled the waves, just as at Salamis 1,000 years earlier. Yet technology pressed on. By the 1570s, even Mediterranean powers mounted cannon in galleys' bows, so-called canon de Braga, allowing a ramming charge laced with iron shot. Battles grew louder, smokier, deadlier. Lepanto, 1571. More than 200 galleys on each side, Christian and Ottoman, collided off the Greek coast. The sea churned with broken oars, splintered masts, and bodies. Musketeers on upper decks fired point blank. Gunners below lit fuses that sent cast-iron balls scything through flesh and pine alike. When the smoke cleared, the Ottoman advance into the western Mediterranean had been halted, but at a cost. 30,000 men dead, dozens of ships lost. The age of oars ended not softly, but in cannon thunder. Even as Europe and the Near East clashed, another maritime giant refined a different path. In Ming-era China, the treasure fleets of Admiral Zheng He, early 15th century, dwarfed anything in Europe. Massive multi-masted junks with watertight bulkheads, balanced rudders, and crews of thousands. Though these expeditions were more diplomatic than warlike, their design proved that wind-powered leviathans could cross oceans with precision long before Europeans circled the globe. But internal politics shuttered China's naval ambitions, leaving the Atlantic powers to transform oceanic combat into a theater of empire. By the 17th century, broadside tactics reigned. Instead of seeking to ram, ships turned shoulder to shoulder in disciplined lines, unleashing synchronized cannonades that hammered holes to driftwood. The line of battle owed its geometry to ancient formations, the phalanx on water, each unit protecting the next. But now, the spears were 72-pound shot. Seamanship replaced sheer muscle, trimming sails under fire, keeping formation in shifting winds, steering damaged hulls clear of lee shores. Admirals signaled with flags and drums, a symphony of color and percussion whose errors could cost empires. Yet beneath decks, echoes of the ancient world lingered. On a 17th century English man-of-war, sailors slept in crowded hammocks, beside food stores and gunpowder kegs, not unlike Phoenician mariners bedded between amphorae of wine. They scrubbed the bilge with brine and vinegar just as Roman crews had. They drilled at the capstan to weigh anchor, straining in rhythm reminiscent of Athenian oarsmen chanting to the flute. And fear, the oldest companion, rode every keel. A cannon burst could maim like a Macedonian catapult. A gale could scatter a fleet more thoroughly than any triremes Digue plus. Of all the changes, perhaps the most profound was strategic. As sail power severed dependence on coastal rest stops, navies projected force across oceans. Spain ferried silver from the New World under escort of war galleons. England's sea dogs harassed those convoys, using fire ships, eerie cousins of Greek fire, to sow panic. Dutch fleets slipped through trade arteries, sacrificing guns for cargo but relying on speed learned from Baltic squall practice. Naval war had become global commerce by other means. and yet older theaters persisted in the Indian Ocean, Arab, and Gujarati dhows. Heirs to the Latin tradition dueled with Portuguese caravels for pepper roots. In Japan, Ataka-boon floating fortresses, bristling with arquebuses, echoed the dual castle ship concept of Hellenistic Syracusan inventors. In West Africa, canoe flotillas still practiced hit-and-run tactics akin to Bronze Age river skirmishes. The technology changed, the beating heart of maritime combat never truly did. What, then, ties the ramming prow of a Bronze Age birim to the cannon-scarred broadside of a galleon? It is the simple truth that the sea punishes hesitation and rewards ingenuity. Every sailor in history has learned that the margin between mastery and oblivion can be the width of a plank or the twist of a gust. Ancient captains lined their hulls with lead to ward shipworms. Tudor shipwrights copper-sheathed theirs for the same reason. Egyptian river marines loosed arrows at papyrus raiders. Venetian crossbowmen shadowed that gesture before loosing quarrels at Ottoman janissaries. Time changed materials, the fear and audacity remained, and the cost beyond count. The Athenian rower collapsed at his bench after a brutal pursuit. The Carthaginian helmsman burned when Roman grapples pinned his deck. The Ottoman janissary slipped into oily water beneath the walls of Malta. Their names rarely grace marble, yet each, as surely as any emperor, shaped the course of empires. Listen, then, to the closing cadence of our voyage. A night sea, starlight trembling on ever-moving black, waves lapping against an empty hull that once bore warriors. Somewhere below, coral grows on bronze rams, crabs scuttle through shattered amphorae, an iron shot lies silent amid silt. The sea has kept their secrets, but we have traced the outlines, oars to sails, rams to cannon, courage to ambition unchecked, and tomorrow, when diesel engines thrum and missiles arc beyond the horizon, they will still echo the first time a Mycenaean galley struck an enemy amidships, still recall the flicker of Greek fire on a midnight tide, still remember the creak of oak as a Portuguese carrack braved Cape storms, because the sea remembers everything, and now, as you drift toward sleep, it remembers for you. Close your eyes, feel the deck rise and fall one last time, hear the distant gulls fade. The ocean is calm, for now. Our watch is over.